sitting still for long periods of time, or even short ones.
Let's start this thing off like this.
He's going to sit next to Nancy and bother his head in the slides. No.
All right. You won't get close. Good. All right, we'll come to order. This is the study session on Tuesday, November 22nd. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Roll call, please.
Roll call with the exception of council members Rosansky and Ridgway. The record will show that there other council members are present.
Good. Okay. I don't know, we'd probably make the all-star team, but we'll eventually fill out this roll call for the regular meeting. Okay, we're going to clarify the consent agendas. We'll start with you, Mr. Selich.
I have nothing.
Mr. Webb?
I have nothing.
Councilman Daigle?
No, thank you.
I'm running, right? No, that's all right, Dick. You're next.
I do have a couple points, and I'd like to understand them. That recycling amendment that you want to have us pass, that looks like we're bound to buy recycled goods regardless. And I don't think we want to be in that position. And so my question is that I oppose the policy based on that at this point in time and would like to pull it, but my question, maybe there's a different understanding than I have.
Dennis, if you could come forward, I think you understand what the city's current practice is, and it sounds like, according to the staff report, that this would continue the city's current practice, which, to my understanding, doesn't mean we'll buy them all the time whenever they are available.
That's correct. I think this policy encourages the use of recycled material but does not require it. The very first bullet under general policy states all city departments shall use recycled products whenever practicable, but it's not required by this policy. It's a statement that we're actually putting into our policies so for acceptance of the grant.
Well, one reason I'm saying this is that rubber tends to age as the amount of sulfur content it gets and the time it is, and basically recyclable rubber doesn't have the same life as new rubber. So there are times when you're going to want to use new, and you do want to have that option.
And that option will still be there. This encourages it but does not require it.
Okay, I'm fine on that one. The Planning Commission agenda is off that, but what about this S-17? That's regarding the fire department, and
That's the memorandum of understanding with the Fire Management Association, which essentially mirrors the MOU that the council approved at your last meeting for the firefighters.
my point is that on the study agenda, or is that a separate item?
That's on the consent calendar this evening.
Okay, well, I'd like to pull that again.
Or if we understand, what your opposition is, and it last time was at 3% at 50, I mean, you could register no and keep that on the consent.
Well, I'll do that possibly at that time.
Nichols, is that it?
Yes.
Good. Thank you. Mr. Rosansky, consent items, rather?
Nothing, thank you.
Okay. City Clerk?
Item number 2, general plan update, review of draft land use element.
Mr. Mayor?
Okay, what's our action item?
Tonight, we are beginning the City Council's review of the land use element, and the Planning Commission started this at their meeting last Thursday, and I think got about halfway through the document. They started with the general policies and then moved into the districts and took up the airport area as the first district, even though that's out of order from the document, because we wanted to make sure that Councilmember Daigle would be here for that discussion, and she is this evening. So we'd like to recommend the same thing for the City Council. And this is the policy document, so we're focusing on the language in the policies as well as what are the permitted land uses and the quantities of land use.
Okay, and tell me then, I'll speak for myself, why this is so important. How does this interrelate to zoning? What does this do for us? Because we've kind of held back on this because this is a very important item as part of the general plan.
Yeah, the land use element and secondarily the circulation element are the most important elements in the general plan. They really set the framework, the policy framework for future development in the city, and it's the policy that underlies our zoning ordinance. In Newport Beach, we have more specificity in our land use element than you would have in many communities, and we need to continue that level of specificity because we need to keep track of amounts of development to comply with Charter Section 423, but at the same time with this update, we're trying to introduce a lot more policy guidance than we have had in the past, which will help developers know what's acceptable to the city, will help the staff review projects, and will help the Planning Commission and the City Council as you look at future development.
Good. Any other comments from council on this before we get started? Okay, last, going through the agenda item itself, we have red insertions and lineouts.
And the red are the changes from the General Plan Advisory Committee, and the ones highlighted in yellow are changes from the Planning Commission. And this is in the document that was just left at your place this afternoon.
Well, let me ask you, so I just got this. How many yellow items are there? 10?
There are more than 10, but as we go through, we'll
You'll
point
explain it?
out
All right, good.
we'll point
All
out
right.
what they are.
Any other questions? Let's start.
Okay, and Mr. Tesher is going to lead this discussion.
Okay, members of the council, I'd like to, because of the length of this element, to acquaint you with the organization and the structure of this element. It's a little bit different than some of the others, and just walk you briefly through the table of contents. The first series of policies address the overall role and character of the city of Newport Beach. This is pretty well taken directly from the vision statement and the work that was performed during the visioning process for the community as well. So that is a section that is probably the most global, if you will, in addressing the city. The second series of policies address within that vision and that intended character. It's basically a documentation of the types of land uses that would be accommodated within the city. The third section then addresses how these will be physically distributed within the community, conceptual statements and policy statements about the overall distribution in the city, which plays out in the fourth section in terms of what will be an updated land use diagram. Let me indicate, and we'll get further along in the policies this afternoon, this is a work in progress, because this is the area that we are working with the GPUC in identifying how the land use diagram actually relates to the land use capacities as defined under the Measure S requirements as well, and we'll come back to that a little bit later in the discussion. The fifth section of this document deals with the physical form of the community, those qualities that distinguish the residential neighborhoods, the commercial districts, mixed-use places, et cetera, that make this a very positive place to live for the residents and the image of the community. And then the sixth section addresses the various neighborhoods, districts, and corridors. Most of these are the areas that we have previously addressed, not so much from the policy standpoint, but we have addressed in terms of the types and densities of land uses as well. And then finally will be the section which is not incorporated in your document, which will be the tabulation in terms of compliance with the charter section as well. So let me begin. The first section of the document for your policies, which begin on page 2, and this is a one-page series of goals and policies, relate to the overall role. It sort of answers a question you see in parens at the top of the page about who we are, answering the questions about that. Just to sort of acquaint you with the changes that were made, the second policy was added by the GPAC because while the first policy addresses the distinct identity and character of the various neighborhoods and places, it was felt by the GPAC that it was also important to emphasize that the city as a whole. It's an agglomeration of many communities, but it's important to identify not only with one's neighborhood, but to identify with the city as a whole as well. And those are the principal changes. There were a couple of minor word changes on 134, and the reference to an economic development strategy, which will be separately considered by the council, was deleted because that has not been completed yet. So go back to the council for any input and discussion of the items here.
Selich, you have any input on this?
No comments. I'm satisfied with it.
Mr. Webb?
We are looking at the policies now?
Yes.
So I understand it, which
The goal
would
and
be...
policy. On page 2.
Yeah, on page 2 and 3.
And I should indicate, unless that there were no differences, in other words, where the GPAC added language, in this case, the Planning Commission concurred with all the language changes and modifications that the GPAC made.
Would it be possible to have the lights on? I can't read this text. Well, we can still see that. Thanks.
But you indicate that there is no difference, but yet you have some yellow highlighted worded verbiage that has been taken out by the Planning Commission.
Yeah, and I should clarify that that was a language change that they felt, just the words, and this was a universal change the commission made throughout the document, that it was, the words "continue to" were probably not appropriate to add in policy because you are following through with, if you follow the wording, the implementation. You're doing this automatically, I think was the sense.
Okay, however, on page 3, the Planning Commission took out the scale of the community, and which was added by
Right.
GPAC.
I'm not on that page yet. That'll
Okay.
be the next item. Thank you.
Nothing on page 2.
Any other comment here before we move on?
Something that you need to have it ahead of time to read. I can't read this and understand it.
Well, let me ask that primary question. Why did we get this the day of the hearing? I mean, I'm not pointing fingers, but is this just how it...
The Planning Commission had this discussion on Thursday night, and this was as quickly as we could turn it around.
Thursday night?
Yes.
Well, today's Tuesday. I'm not, no offense to staff, but that's a pretty good distance. In my office, I mean, if you had something on Thursday morning, you'd have it Thursday afternoon. I mean, I just want to know, if this is some meaningful stuff, then we just got it today and we have to digest it, and you're looking for input. It's probably not appropriate. But I'm not going to make a decision, but I've heard that from the council.
I think these are fairly minor changes that we're talking about here, and I just as soon move forward on this. It was up to me.
All right, Mr. Selich?
I agree.
Good. All right, that's the council? Sure. Good, let's go.
Then on to page 3 and page 4. This addresses the uses to be accommodated. Again, the changes that were made by the commission in this case did indeed delete the scale of the community as referenced in the first policy at the top of the page as well. And the feeling was that the sense of the policy talks about what uses are going to be accommodated, not their physical form and character, but it talks about it being in balance with the natural environment and the open spaces. So they felt that the actual uses themselves, which are referred to in the first part of the sentence, are indeed reflected in the subsequent section of this plan in 5.0, which addresses scale and character subsequently. So it's more or less a technical change.
Does the head of GPAC have any comments on that one? So you don't mind the change?
I do have a comment, and that is, it seems to me that if we're going to have more control and more use of our lower bay, that we want to emphasize more that it's a commercial harbor, and that basically this is a harbor that we have to be able to maintain for that to happen. And And basically, that would allow us to dredge, that would allow us to clean plants, that would allow us to make decisions on whether we're going to grow fish that bring all the seals in and sink boats. And we need to have that flexibility, in my opinion, my suggestion is that we not overemphasize, at least as far as the lower harbor goes, the growing of seaweed and so forth, because we're going to end up killing ourselves. Right now, we have the big boats down in Dana Harbor this winter because they couldn't get in.
Which policy are you referring to?
I'm referring to the fact that we were talking about when we're emphasizing the harbor particularly, that we did put in and commercial boaters, but we're tending to push the environmental goals, and in that area, I think we're going to end up killing ourselves because we're in direct opposition to.
Here in the land use element, we aren't speaking to the environmental goals and the biological health and all of the day. That was in the natural resources element that the council reviewed a month or so ago.
And I think that with this land use section, most people normally consider the harbor to be below the bridge and in the upper Newport Bay Reserve and ecological area upstream of the bay. However, there are some harbor facilities related to the dunes and the other area, but in general, I think that this is consistent with most of the harbor area.
If we can reflect that, is what I'm saying, Don, I think it would be very good in any way we can.
Excuse me? Could on that, I'm reading this, the language here in that 2.1, where we deleted the scale of the community. To me, it just doesn't read properly with the language not there, and I would suggest leaving in at least the word community. Are we talking about natural resources throughout the world here, or is it?
Something like the community's natural resources.
Well, that are in balance with community, natural resources, and open spaces. I would suggest that. It just doesn't roll off the tongue otherwise.
Good. Okay, we'll move on. The third section and policies of the plan address how the uses will be organized. It doesn't address the map per se, but it talks about the basic structure and organization. It refers in the first policy to the various neighborhoods, districts, and quarters of the community. And then it talks about change and growth from two perspectives. One is the notion in 3.2 of the conservation of existing neighborhoods, where there will be no change. In fact, if you look at the land use diagrams, you'll see that about 92 to 96% of the city, in effect, is conserved by the policies as well. And then in 3.3, it addresses the opportunities for change. Now, this is a summary of, indeed, the policies in this section for each of the geographic sub-areas of the city that are addressed later in this plan in Section 6.0. So as we recommended to the GPAC, and it was very effective, as well as to the Planning Commission, is at this point in time, we sort of hold off of any debates on the bullets and talking about the sub-areas, because we're going to be addressing each one of these individually in Section 6 in terms of the mix of uses that are suggested here as well. So what we would do is, if you make any changes in terms of the land use recommendations for the sub-area, what we would recommend then is we come back and revise this based upon your actions for each of the sub-areas. The commission and the committee, as you will notice here, did make a few minor text changes for clarification that you see here, et cetera. And then there is specifically policy called out on Banning Ranch. Again, we have multiple pages on Banning Ranch coming later in this document, so I would recommend that we hold that particular policy until we get to that section as well. And I think all the other changes were relatively minor or wordsmithing. And I think Nancy is shaking her head affirmatively.
So we're looking at 5 and 6 now?
We're looking at pages 5 and 6, yes, sir.
I guess I understand your concept of not discussing the various elements individually. However, in the Banning Ranch, since we had ultimately mentioned the active park use as a part of open space, it would seem appropriate to, at least someplace in that paragraph, have the active park use mentioned. Is it?
It mentions parkland, but would you feel more comfortable if we added the word active in front of the word parkland in the third line?
And providing parkland
Okay.
amenities to serve nearby neighborhoods.
Okay, we'll get into the more specific stuff later on then, I guess.
I would have just a comment on the Corona Del Mar enhancement of public improvements and parking. I don't know exactly what you're doing with parking, but parking is being removed because it doesn't have the same dollar value as houses. So it seems like we're kind of not moving in the same direction. I mean, our actual practical policies, we've been building on the lots that are closest to commercial for some time, and those are infilling. And they're infilling with homes. And so the commercial parking is being diminished. And we're not asking any of the commercial to come up with any more parking, except if it's a brand-new structure on it. So I'm questioning what the enhancement of public improvements and parking, I don't know what we mean by that. What improvements and what parking?
I think the public improvements are the vision plan from the Corona Del Mar Bid and Homeowners Association, and then the parking policies address the very issue that you're raising, so I think that would be a good one to discuss in detail when we get to Corona Del Mar, and you can see if the detailed policy is accomplishing what you want.
There is a lot of controversy in Corona Del Mar about the public improvements that you're talking about, and I don't think this is the time to discuss that. But generally speaking, they don't like the vegetation, they don't like a lot of the things being done there. So I don't know, this is not in tune with the residents' feel.
Isn't this something that would be discussed in more detail to where you could get into those items when we actually talk about Corona Del Mar?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
So this is more of the summary area
Yes.
right here. So Dick, couldn't we get into those details a little bit later?
I think so. My only question is the enhancement of this. I don't believe that that's appropriate. I think the continuation of the present zoning and the enhancement of the whole community makes sense, but particularly just these public improvements, that isn't even being well accepted in the community. There's people that are asking right now to collect money to remove some of the objects that have been put there.
I guess public improvements could mean almost anything that we want them to mean. There is an item on the agenda tonight that talks about curb and gutter going in, which certainly is a public improvement. So at this point, when we're talking about basic policies, when you say public improvements, that doesn't necessarily automatically mean Vision 2000 improvements.
Well, I just asked, and that was how it was defined, Homer. I'm not trying to make that.
I think it's important that the definition, when we get to Corona Del Mar and discussions about policies there, that's where the definition really needs to take place.
Okay.
I guess
I accede to that.
Go back to Banning Ranch. The one paragraph, it does not mention the alternate. It does not mention the alternate use if the property isn't acquired for open space. Should that have been mentioned at least, or should we, does it?
It does, I think it does, because the second sentence says if the property cannot be acquired in a timely manner, et cetera. It's okay.
I'm reading and not reading, I'm sorry.
I'm doing the same thing here with it.
All right, you have everything you need?
Okay.
direction on that?
Let's move on to the next section. The next section of the plan is a section that does two things. I'll have two components to it. First will be an updated land use diagram, which will be in effect a replacement of the diagram that's on the wall over there, which will have the new land use designations, and with that will be a table, which is a series of new land use classifications. So let me indicate, as you will see in here, and this is based upon the precedent that was established in the recently adopted local coastal plan, and that precedent basically recognized that some of the existing city land use classifications were very broad and did provide the city with really good guidance and choices. So, for example, in your existing general plan, you have a single land use classification apply to both Fashion Island and Corona del Mar. And I think most people would acknowledge that those are two very different places in terms of the types of uses, scale of development, et cetera. So by having a single land use classification, it's been difficult to interpret what uses ultimately would be permitted and then implemented in the area. So the attempt here is first to go into more detail to reflect the characteristics of place. So, for example, we have now for the first time in the citywide general plan a neighborhood commercial category, which didn't exist before besides just a general commercial. We also have a regional commercial category for the first time, recognizing that there are certain commercial uses that are intended for a regional market in terms of customer base and economic activity as well. We also have more detail in here because of the issue of the growth limitations to meet the charter requirements of Section 423. And those requirements, as you well know, deal with land use capacities. So you will see in here for the first time, really, in your general plan, details of floor area ratios and densities that are more precise and in smaller increments than the broader ranges that were indeed defined in your earlier general plan. Now, as I said, this is a work in progress. Staff has been working incredibly diligently. Patty's had her staff out there actually measuring building footprints to know what actually is physically on site out there so that we have a really good handle upon what is on site. They have been pouring through the records and also looking at the building permit data in terms of understanding how many housing units in each area as well as how many square feet as well. To that end, and this is one area, Councilmember Selich, if I could ask you to dim the light so we can just see this one diagram. I think this is the only one we do need to see. This is the beginnings, and I repeat, the beginnings of what we're looking for in a land use diagram. And you will see on here, and let me just use an example, you will see a land use category such as residential very low, which is consistent with the kinds of categories you've had in the past. But you'll also see on here a number, and in this case, I think, I can't read it myself here, it says 3.97 or 3.87. And what that means is in that area, that is the actual density if you counted all the housing units on those sites and divided by the acres. And in that area, if we have no additional capacity for development under the Measure S, or I should say the charter requirements, that would be the density assigned to that particular area as well. So that it's very clear to anybody who has property in the area what the potential yield of development is. That would be done not only for residential areas, but you see similar indicators for the commercial properties within the city as well. Now, as I said, this is a work in progress. We are charged to go back to GPUC with, indeed, the process for how that's going to be continued. So, again, I don't hate to keep putting things off, but we'll come back to this diagram to the City Council beyond this in terms of the actual designations and the classifications in the future. But this is the direction it's beginning to take, and city staff, again, it builds upon the work, very good work that was done in the LCP by staff to quantify and to begin to understand land use classification, and that's the precedence. One of the things you will see in here that's different than the LCP for the first time is a series of classifications on mixed-use development. And the mixed-use development falls basically into three kinds of categories. Areas in which you're integrating housing with retail or office uses vertically, areas in which you may be physically integrating them horizontally, such as the airport area that we'll be coming to later, and then areas in which you're actually mixing housing into waterfront-related uses as well. So I'll leave that at this point in time. Again, as I said, we'll be coming back to this in detail, but you will note here that the Commission, in review of this, did make a number of relatively minor changes. You will see in this chart quantities that were changed, And I suggest that we hold on to those until we get to the sub-areas, because the quantities of use pertaining to the airport area and Banning Ranch we'll address when we get to those sub-areas in those districts a little bit later.
Could I ask what the white means? I mean, when you
White
have-
is open space or parklands. It's not it's either publicly owned lands, which there is no density classification. It is designated open space, or it may be a golf course, as you will see up there, obviously west of Fashion Island as well. So that there is, in effect, no intensity, either units per acre or commercial buildings on those sites.
Well, some of this area carries zoning. For instance, over there in Newport Center, right out as you go in the entrance, you see two properties there that are to the white, over further to the left.
Over here?
Right there.
Yeah.
Those have commercial buildings on them.
Yeah.
And you have no zoning marked there at all? I mean,
This is
a mistake, or is this?
As I understand, this is a work in progress. Staff is actually still in the process of quantifying some of these uses. So this is a work in progress. It's not done yet.
Okay, let me pick one more, and that is the Corona Del Mar Elementary School. That's presently zoned multifamily commercial, or multifamily residential. And I don't think the school district's going to be very happy if we take that off and make that nothing. Right now, it's nice and white, but if we slip this through on them, I think they're going to be pretty unhappy.
I remind you, this is not a zoning map. This is a general plan map. And so the intent is to be reflective of what there is on the ground. And we have a public category for schools, which the intent is to identify all the schools in the general plan by what the use is. And in this case, it would be a public use. Zoning is a different item.
Woody, I have
This didn't matter until we got rid of Carnation School. And when we got rid of Carnation School, the fact that it had zoning on the map was extremely valuable to the school district. And what you're doing is eliminating it. And by saying, well, this is what we have on the ground, that you don't do that with the portions of Fashion Island in the middle there where it's all commercial. I mean, I think we have to be consistent, but in this area, we're really causing major angst, I think, in the school district.
We'll work with staff to make sure that that issue is addressed.
Woody, question for you, kind of big picture. The efforts to define these districts in detail, is this going to ultimately result in a better tool to preserve the unique character of individual districts?
Yes, the intent of this was indeed for those neighborhoods where the conservation is clearly intended, that the individuals who may live there, property owners, developers, et cetera, will have clear intentions regarding the densities and uses within those areas, as well as those areas in which the city policies for change, because you'll have some understanding about the intention, the scale, and the magnitude of the change as well.
Okay.
So it's intended to be a much better tool than just a series of tables that you have today.
Thanks.
I have a question. Yeah, in 4.1, I assume that's the Planning Commission knocked out that public use, and why was that?
We have actually a separate policy later that you will see in section 6.0.
That's fine. There's a reason for it, that's all I need to know. That's fine.
There is a reason.
All right. Any other comments here? And what sort of a chunk are we dealing with here? The whole thing through page 13?
Yes. Up through page 13, yes.
And there's a big chunk taken out on page 12, that red deletion. It's a GPAC deletion.
Yes, this deletion, and as we come to the Mariners Mile area, the recommendation of the advisory committee was to delete the recommendation for housing on the water side, the harbor side area of Coast Highway in that area. And this one classification uniquely applied to that area, so by their deletion of housing from that area, it in effect deleted the
So this is the bay on the windows, is that what we're talking about? Would that be on the bay side
Bay
of the
side.
Coast Highway in that area?
Correct.
No housing?
This is what the city council asked to be added back in, if I remember correctly.
That's
Well, we
correct.
dealt with
As we come later to the sub-areas, what you will see is that the advisory committee made a recommendation to the commission and then to you to restore their original recommendations.
Okay, so that this is a change of the city council's recommendation
Yes.
to them to go back. So was there, do we discuss this in more detail
Yes, we'll discuss
later
this when
on?
we get to Mariners Mile. Yes, sir.
Okay, let's put a big question mark by that, because I'm not real comfortable with totally eliminating the residential on the bay side of Coast Highway.
And the Planning Commission did not get to Mariners Mile, so this doesn't reflect their thinking on it. And just one other clarification there, even though the GPAC has reaffirmed their original recommendations, and the Planning Commission and City Council may agree with some or all of those, we are not changing the project description for purposes of the EIR. We are proceeding with preparing the EIR according to the direction the City Council gave us.
If you could refresh my memory, what was the GPAC recommendation on Mariners Mile?
And we'll, again, come to the sub-area a little bit later. On the inland side of the highway, there was a recommendation for commercial and housing mix in a couple different scenarios that you'll see when we get into the detail of that area. On the water side, on the harbor side, the recommendation was for marine-related uses, commercial, et cetera, but not for housing. That was the difference they made. The council had suggested, as you'll see in here by what was struck out, some language about a percentage of the area being suitable for housing, and as Councilmember Webb indicated, we'll be coming back to that in the subsequent section.
So we'll put on hold that deletion?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
This is like the other, sir. What we'll do is we'll come back around based upon the recommendations and have to fine-tune any of these classifications based upon the recommendations you make later.
Well, with that said, I hope we come around and don't fall asleep before we get there. So, or we end up with something that's usable, because that somebody's going to have to read this 5 years from now and know kind of to continue to make sense of it. Okay. Any other comments on this? Through page 13? Okay, none.
Okay, the next section we move into is a series of pages addressing the community character, the community design character of various districts. It runs through page 23, and I think for the ease of discussion, what we'll do is maybe go through all those sort of like sections. Pages 14 through 16, through the middle of page 17, address the design character of the residential neighborhoods. It sets up first on page 14 policies that relate to any type of residential unit, any type of neighborhood. On page 15, you will see recommendations regarding single-family detached and duplex, and then the bottom of 15 on to the end of this, to the middle of page 17, multifamily residential, and we threw up some pretty pictures just to sort of illustrate the characteristics of some of these areas that you see on the wall. As well, to illustrate some of the principles as well. So that just shows some images. We're going to be adding images from the city of Newport Beach. We just wanted to create some images that explain, in this place, the character of single-family housing, multifamily housing illustrations as well. These you'll also see I should indicate up front that some of the guidelines in here regarding multifamily were actually originally created specifically for the airport area, and it had been pulled up front to this section because it was a sense of staff that these recommendations apply to multifamily, whether they're in the airport area or other areas of the city as well.
Do you think we should use some real buildings rather than fictitious buildings? I mean, these are architectural sketches in many areas. I mean, that are not even on the ground at this point, right?
No, these are built. They're not in the city. They're in other locations, but they are illustrations of architectural
They're not in the
principles.
city, you're saying?
That's correct. We will be adding some additional
Well,
photographs.
don't you think
buildings
our
in the city.
people should be able to reflect what they might see by actually, visibly going to a location and seeing it in our city?
Yeah. We've indicated on the cover that we'll be adding some additional photographs to do so, yes.
Well, I think they all should be that way, frankly, not just, if we have something in residential, we certainly have residential here that's like you want to see. Why don't we use it? Then we have people that can go to that. Or multifamily, you have multifamily here.
Yep.
I mean, I think it just has a lot more then people can see in scale and everything else how it fits.
As we publish the document in March, we'll definitely do that. Yes. Sharon asked me to indeed point out some of the changes. You'll see on page 15 some changes in single-family detached. I think the largest discussion on the commission, just to give you a concern and expressions of issues that were raised by the commission, were questions about the city's regulation or review of single-family neighborhood design. I think that was the single greatest issue that surfaced here within all of the concerns. And you will see there were, for example, a couple of bullets specifically that were recommended to be deleted towards the end on 515 at the top of page 15. You will see the language was changed on the second bullet. This was the question about the size and, in effect, and the scale of single-family housing. You will see there the commission felt that the original language is a little bit too restrictive, i.e. by saying that it would be compatible with surrounding development as it originally was worded with density, scale, et cetera. The commission felt that there should be some allowance for change in scale and density in some of the existing neighborhoods of the community as well. Similarly, they deleted the 5.1.17, which specifically called for, in effect, or implied design review for enlargement of existing single-family units. This is the term that we all have all heard called mansionization. This was a policy that was originally crafted to address that based upon the GPAC discussion. The Planning Commission felt that that was inappropriate, and that was their recommendation for deletion in that section. Most of the other changes on the following pages are again, in most cases, wording and fairly minor compared to the single family was probably the biggest issue that the commission had here.
And what was the response to GPAC for that? That's a deletion by the Planning Commission?
Yes.
Okay, what do you think?
The second bullet point really does change the whole meaning of that particular policy. That's one, and it is, we realize that one of the controversial policies in many ways in the visioning process. There were disagreements between those who wanted to keep a certain scale in the neighborhood and those who said, it's my property, I don't want it, I think. But GPACs went with the original wording that was contradicting what that wording
And Nancy, 5.1.7, I think, also would be a concern.
So both are not GPAC, and I think they're the same thing.
Some of the,
Can I ask, what is your background? What did you expect? I mean, because I'm, between the deletions and the additions, what was GPAC's focus on this whole section? It's a fairly significant part.
Community character, trying to maintain some of that character and being concerned about, trying to avoid the word nationalization because it doesn't necessarily express things. It's not necessarily big as how it's done, but when you say go along with the development, that would be changing the community character of the village. That seems to be very important that it's coming out. Not necessarily you have to keep it small, you have to keep it the character, the existing character of the various villages. That's important.
So is your position, speaking just for yourself, I suppose, that these changes by the Planning Commission change that whole focus?
Yes. When I speak,
Oh, no, fine. That's even better. That's great. Any comment here?
Yeah, I have to comment.
Mr. Zansky?
Well, more directed to 5.1.7. Personally, I don't have a problem with leaving that language in. It's not setting up design review boards. It's just saying consider the appropriateness of establishing those design guidelines where we might think we might need them. So I don't know that it's a mandate. I think it just, as Nancy had mentioned, kind of reflects a little bit of the angst in this community that we need to be careful as we move ahead and not put up a bunch of big boxes all over town. And if that trend continues, then maybe we do need to look at some design guidelines.
Do you feel the same about the ones in 5.1.5?
Not as much. I mean, I don't think that our neighborhood should be stagnant, and I think that, not to say that the language that GPAC came up with would be stagnant, but, and maybe we can incorporate both sets of language in there to kind of find a middle ground.
I think maybe more of a kind of a property rights argument might be is that when people purchase the property, they have the same kind of setbacks and height as people that currently live in the neighborhood. It may be that some of those that currently live in the neighborhood didn't build out as they could, and the newer homeowners, they economically choose to utilize that property.
Well, I don't think it's a matter of not allowing people to economically, or, however they want to utilize their property. I just think it's a recognition that, let's face it, we're not Irvine here. We don't have design guidelines all over town that says what you can build and what you can't build, at least in a lot of areas of town. Probably the areas that matter are the ones that have CC&Rs or planned communities. I mean, we do have guidelines in those areas, and you're right, when people buy in, they understand what they're buying. That being said, I don't think that we should allow any monstrosity in town, so I guess there has to be a happy medium.
So you would believe that if someone purchases a property and they go to the planning department, the planning says you 10-foot front yard, 3-foot side yard, and you can go 28 feet tall and have this FAR, that they don't necessarily should be able to build to that?
No, I think that they should have the right to build under whatever our guidelines are. That's fine. But if we have a process where we're going to set up different guidelines, I don't think that because someone bought a property in 2005 that we can't change a setback or change, FAR or things like that in 2007, even though they bought it in 2005 and had a understanding of what the rules were then. I mean, rules changed. Okay. And just as we're acknowledging that there are different trends in neighborhoods, I think what the Planning Commission was trying to point out.
Maybe staff can clarify this, but I would envision that as more of a development standard versus a design guideline in terms of setbacks and those kinds of things.
Yeah, well, setbacks typically are more development standard, but getting closer to the design guideline ideas, if you have an additional setback for a second story to help with the scale and the massing. One thing I was going to say, one of the comments at the Planning Commission that I had not thought of before, and this is with regard to that second bullet under 515 regarding the trends, was that if we kept with the original language of compatibility with surrounding development, some neighborhoods or portions of neighborhoods have experienced a trend of changing, so in that neighborhood, being compatible with surrounding might be a larger house, and in another neighborhood, they haven't experienced the trend yet, so there you would be being compatible with a smaller house, and it didn't seem like an equal treatment for all residential neighborhoods, which is why they went with the language of the surrounding trends.
Are we saying that the statements on page 15 are preferences, but not anything enforceable that would come later on?
Well, I think that this is the policy that's telling the city to develop something enforceable, because if we don't have some kind of a process to implement these, there's really no point in including them in the general plan.
Well, the word requires at the beginning of each one.
What's been the tradition of our community? Maybe Patty can help out. I know she's been here 20, 25 years. Have we ever had has the city ever administered design guidelines?
We have design guidelines in two of our specific plans, the one for Cannery Village and McFadden Square, and there is no process in that specific plan for using them. So I think they're sort of for the information and advice of a developer. We have, as people have come through with discretionary approval projects, we have analyzed the project against those design guidelines, but there's nothing in the specific plan that directs us to do that. For the Central Balboa specific plan, it had been the same system where there were design guidelines and no process, but recently we amended that, and there is now a development plan review process so that the projects in that area are measured against those design guidelines.
Are design guidelines something more common within a specific plan, sort of a document, than within our general zoning?
The actual guidelines themselves are normally composed or incorporated in specific plans, yes, in answer to your question. It is the trend, however, to create the overarching policy, though, in the general plan, to indicate the characters. And you see here that there are not specific standards, i.e., nothing quantified in terms of what they should be. They set direction, but do not set the guideline that would be normally, yes, as a part of the specific plan. Or in some cases, zoning ordinances. We have actually a trend in zoning ordinances now to create what are called form-based codes. And form-based codes, you're smiling, I'll go to the whole form-based code 101, would take me too many hours to explain that. But it's a change, it's a fundamental change in zoning ordinances, which really looks at the form of the city beyond just the traditional zones categories.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Webb?
In the first bullet, what was the thought in removing the phrase "to avoid the appearance of box-like buildings"? Because that's the whole reason for articulation, is to avoid that appearance.
It's redundant.
I had this question from the commission as well. The sense, and please, Nancy, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the direct or the explicit question was asked by one of the GPAC members was, would this then preclude a residential structure, because we're talking about single-family residential here, and you'll see it appears later in multifamily too, but would this preclude the development of a adobe-style house that is basically large building masses and volumes that are more block-like? You can identify some architects like Ricardo Legaredo who does do design like that, and et cetera. And say that again fast. But that was the intent. They didn't want to preclude. I think the sense of the committee was there may be some good architecture that plays out as a block-like structure under that definition. They felt it was too limiting.
And as long as you have the language that says articulation and modulation, that's addressing the concern.
Okay, because I know that Brian Jeanette is a local architect and has built his house of the Adobe-type style, and I don't consider it box-like, but it has a lot of square corners, because it has a lot of articulation to it. So the other thing is in underneath the pictures, you removed variation of roof lines. Why was that removed?
That was removed again for, there was a sense of the committee that they wanted to, or the commission in this case, to have the possibility of flat roofs.
And I think it was also because the policies didn't address roof lines. The caption was going further than the actual policy language.
Well, does that roof line refer to individual buildings or just roof lines in general? Because if it's roof lines in general, a flat roof would be variety if you had all peaked roofs.
Yes. The answer is yes to both.
I think we have a real problem in Corona Del Mar. If, for example, if that picture on the right were to reflect Corona Del Mar houses as we move away from the ocean, that the first one on the left there with the real high roof line that just totally wipes out anybody else's view is just exactly what everybody doesn't want. Because here you're articulating the house to get it up way high in one particular portion, which just wipes out the view of everybody above it. And in old Corona Del Mar, you have a basin, and each house has a slight elevation above the other one, and each house has some view if it's used reasonably. And if it's used as Mr. Getz did, we basically wipe out everybody's view, and we take it away, and there was never any penalties applied to it. Everybody got their extra big house, and everyone else suffered because we had a guy that to pull a fast one. And that's what this is illustrating. I don't think we want that. I mean, show it the other way, left or Right, instead of right to left or something.
We will change the photographs. We will change the photographs to reflect Newport Beach development.
Mr. Selich.
Yeah, looking at the original language of 5.1.5, 6, and 7, it seems to me that everything that's said here, until you get to the point in 5.1.7, which says consider the appropriateness of, that all of those really refer to design standards, which really go to promote better design and development that occurs, which would be things that would occur under our zoning code, and really have nothing to do with mansionization per se. And it seems that just after the word consider, that's where we get into that, and then making the statement, we're really not mandating anything, but just saying that we'd be considering doing that in certain neighborhoods. So I guess from my standpoint, I'm not sure I see where there's anything really that wrong with all the original language here.
I agree with Councilman Selich, and I think that's what I had said in the beginning, except that when we do get to that last bullet point under 5.1.5, it says orientation to desirable sunlight and views, which I agree with, but while avoiding unnecessarily blocking sunlight for neighboring buildings, respecting the privacy needs of residents of the development and surrounding properties. I get a little concerned there because now that's what a lot of our arguments are about. When other neighbors come down, and I think we've always said that we don't protect views. I don't know that you do have a legal right to sunlight. I think that's what our setbacks and things are for, and I would prefer to see that handled in our setback requirements than some kind of a blanket statement here that says that it really, opens up Pandora's box, I think, when you start looking at that. And then you're really looking at design review issues.
I think I would agree with that, because when we have a 3- and 4-foot side yard setbacks, you really can't protect privacy and sunlight, because the property owner, because of our setbacks, has been allowed to build up to the property line. They can articulate it, and I am a strong believer in that, because one of the ugliest things that we have is a house that's built with a solid full length of the property line, 4 feet from the property line. So I think that as far as I'm concerned, we need to improve on the articulation wording, and but I agree with Mr. Selich also that I would like to see the GPAC approved wording left in, including the roof line one, up to consider in the item 7. Is that what you had recommended, Mr. Selich?
Well, I had suggested even leaving that in, because
Okay.
it would allow us to continue to study it in the future and decide whether we really want to do it, as opposed to making that decision right now.
Right. I would agree with that.
Well, I'm probably and obviously in the minority, but I would support the Planning Commission. I think that if you look, for example, the architecture of City Hall, we got 50 different opinions about it, and it's very subjective. And in terms of the city getting into design guidelines in our neighborhood, that's not been a tradition of our community. Something they do in Laguna Beach, I think it's a slippery slope, and so I would support the Planning Commission's recommendation.
Well, it's a slippery slope until they build a cube next to you. And look at the Port Streets. I mean, I live in a community where cubes are in the rage, and they're not even vertical cubes. They go underground when they can't get enough.
Well,
So I guess my point is, then you're going to change the whole character of the community. You're going to say the market controls, and that's what you're going to get. If you don't have somebody to intervene, then the market will demand, and you will drive out the small homeowner who's not going to live in the shadow of a big house for the next 20 years, and they'll just move. And so the market will control versus what is a normal setback character format that the original development was developed under. It's not saying it's right or wrong, but you're kind of saying it's to the highest bidder at a certain point if you just take out any design limitations, which may be where the council wants to go. But I think the GPAC did is try to put some restraint into that. Is that right, Nancy? I mean, we don't have anybody from the Planning Commission here, but a lot of work went in. I know a lot of work went into this, what appears to be one-page summary. Is that?
Can I suggest that we straw vote page 15 so that we can move forward?
I think it's pretty obvious where it is.
Are we talking about consider on, the word consider, the rest of that sentence being removed or staying? Isn't that what
We're talking about it, leaving it in.
Okay, and that would tend to move toward design guidelines to a much higher extent, is what my...
All it says to consider the appropriateness, and we'd probably leave it for another day if we ever decided that we, as a city council, wanted to establish guidelines for a neighborhood, or that was the trend, I guess, or whatever you want to call it, that there is an opportunity to do so.
I would make one comment for you, and that is the CCR neighborhoods, those that have covenants and restrictions, are the least desirable neighborhoods in Newport Beach nowadays, not the most desirable, because of the covenants that say all the view planes and everything else have made it so people can't go up, so they have to go down. So they're building basements and things like that, versus where they have zoning, there's enough flexibility that people are designing houses that are relatively above ground. And Corona del Mar, Newport Heights, those are the areas that are having the biggest growth in real estate values, only for that reason.
Is it so that in the port streets there is a design review committee to prevent the cubes?
It's basically setbacks, two-thirds lot coverage.
But isn't there design review committee?
No,
I thought there was.
not really. I mean, there has to be, in a sense of compatibility, you can't build something out of chrome. I mean, there are some limits, but other than that, it's really a setback issue and a lot coverage issue.
So where do you draw the line between chrome and a cube?
Well, it depends if you live next to one. I mean, that's the difference.
But couldn't the board say this is a cube? We don't want a cube?
Through CC&Rs?
Right.
Through an amendment of the CC&Rs, yeah.
Well, if we're going to straw vote it, I say we
What do you
put it back the way it was, but I don't really like that language in
The fifth bullet.
the fifth bullet, yeah. You can leave orientation desirable to sunlight and views.
Okay.
That would be fine, but after that language, I would remove that, and then leave the rest of it the way it was.
So put a period after views.
Correct.
I'll support that.
All right, well, that's two. All right? Do we have three?
Yeah, I'll support it.
That's three. Okay, how about this other end?
No.
We have a no, and we have a no?
I don't understand what he's exactly doing.
Okay, why don't you explain that to us, Woody, because you're going to have to write the revised version.
Okay. Which one? I'm sorry. The
Or Sharon, maybe you can.
Yeah.
yeah, that's good.
I don't know,
The
I'm not...
language,
5.17. Basically, it's suggesting that we put a period here, so just that out, and then put all this other back in.
Come on. Can I say it so I'm sure I have it right? It appears that the consensus is to go back to the original GPAC language for everything on page 15, except the fifth bullet under 5.1.5, we would strike everything after views.
Yeah, that's true.
Go ahead
Are
and
we
keep
going
that.
Oh, yeah.
to leave the duplex
Yes,
word
we
in
need
or
that.
out?
We need that.
Okay, leave the duplex word in.
That was actually a staff correction, not a planning commission change.
But you got yellow. Okay.
No,
Wait a minute,
we have three.
you only have three votes. I mean, we got a no from Leslie, what do you have from you, Dick?
No.
Well, that's two, so that's three. I kind of like the way the GPAC did the fifth bullet, to put it all in.
Okay, but so you like the GPAC except for the one bullet? You'd like to have that?
Well, I wouldn't put a period in the fifth bullet. I would,
Everything else is okay?
sure, yeah.
I'll go with that.
That's two. I mean, just,
So the fifth bullet would be included, and 5.17 would be included in.
right.
This is far from the council's final action on this. How about...
Well, listen, it's right, wait a minute, Sharon, it's right before us. It's fresh. If we get into this phone book again, it can't be any riper than it is right now to make a decision, or to come to a logjam and saying we can't make one.
I was just going to suggest that we highlight that language at the end of the fifth bullet, and when you're considering the document finally after the EIR is out and after you have public hearings, that'll just show you that that's one you might want to think about some more.
All right, what do we think of that? Council?
No.
Good idea.
Okay, we have,
We're not going to take it out, we're not going to leave it in, we're going to highlight it for future consideration.
And it
I don't
wouldn't
know.
affect the EIR.
Let's just make a decision here. Come on,
Good.
guys.
That's two for a
I'd just
decision.
rather make a decision.
okay?
We keep deferring everything. We're going to have one
Fine
big
with
mess
me.
at the end. So let's make a decision.
All right, okay, we have three the way you want it, Mr. Rosansky. We have two the way I want it. We have two negatives over here. So we seem to be no consensus on this.
I would just reiterate that it hasn't been our tradition to get into design guidelines in neighborhoods. And that there are CC&Rs and there are, the association can take that on.
I'd like to be able to vote with Mayor Heffernan and Councilman Selich here on this. So maybe if staff would help me out a little bit. If we did leave the rest of the language past views, what are we making a significant change in how, maybe legal counsel can advise us on this?
I think that it will be kind of a significant change in approach, a policy approach, not necessarily a rule or a regulation, to start getting involved in the blocking of sunlight and respecting of privacy, particularly with the standards that we have, whatever guidelines we come up with. I have to admit to knowing firsthand the Laguna Beach design review process, which I don't think that this commits the council to. But when you start getting into the concept of protecting privacy and sunlight, you start creating real issues for the Planning Commission in making decisions on where they're going to go with allowing one person to develop their property over another.
Right. We might as well throw views in there as well.
We
We might as well throw views in there as well. I mean,
that's what I'm saying.
That's really what people really want to protect, is their view of the ocean, their view of the bay, their view of the city lights, the view of everything else.
In Laguna, views are very important, but I got to tell you, privacy and sunlight and the mayor's comment about, having a big, huge two-story house or a big, large house looming above you makes it very difficult for you to maybe want to stay in your smaller house next door. So it's a big issue, and it can create a lot of problems in a neighborhood if the council chooses to go that way. I'm not saying that, I'm not recommending you not to, I'm just saying that it does introduce a whole new policy decision to the way the council and the cities have been handled before.
Right. It would be a significant change.
It would be, until that second floor bedroom goes right opposite your kitchen and then looks into it every night. I guess it's, with no respect, you have it on a 3-foot setback, which we have, so it's 6 feet away. There's your wall, there it is. And the question is, should the city be the policeman? That's really the question, versus the association, which Councilman Daigle indicates.
Well, Mr. Mayor, let me ask Woody a question here. Do you see that the bullet point 5, that would be something that would be able to achieve the principle in that section? Would you be able to develop development standards that are quantifiable development standards as opposed to design review standards? Like variation of setbacks to get additional sunlight and views in, or you can only go so many feet on, like Mr. Webb's illustration of a long wall on a very deep lot, that you can only run so many feet before the building has to jog in and create an interior atrium or courtyard or something like that. Aren't those things you can quantify in development standards as opposed to dealing with design review criteria? So that this does become an objective, quantifiable thing that's done in the zoning code and not something that's left to the whims of somebody.
Too subjective. I think you can. It is going to have to be custom crafted to reflect various neighborhoods of the city, because changes of topography, parcel size may indeed create different situations as well. I think there are certain elements of this that are quantifiable indeed. Yes, and I've seen cities do it.
What's your point?
Well, my point is that, you have this fear of, that you can't do it, that we're getting into, design review, and we're really not. Like I said, is everything up to the word consider is something that from what I can see, is quantifiable in development standards and zoning regulations.
Yeah.
And also, the way I read this, it says orientation to desirable sunlight and views. It means you set up design criteria to orient the building to views. It's not that you're protecting the views of someone else. You're trying to maximize the views that that particular piece of property enjoys. So
That's the first part, but the second part deals with the neighbor, while avoiding unreasonably blocking sunlight for neighboring buildings.
well,
respecting the privacy.
my illustration on how you deal with that quantifiably in the long run of a building, where you have a jog and a setback or something like that, that answers that question. It becomes a quantifiable thing as opposed to a judgment thing.
Well,
You're
it doesn't,
asking-
because you're looking at, well, where's their backyard? Maybe the building can go 50 feet, and it's going to block the sunlight in their backyard. So does that mean the next guy's backyard? So now we shouldn't do that. Or maybe there's a window there where you want to put your bedroom window, or this or that. And to me, it's just, then you're pitting property owner versus property owner, and I think
Just
the
for
city attorney's correct that
clarification.
it's a significant change.
Ed, you're saying to stop after the word view with a period, and the fifth thing down, and nothing after consider in the last one? Am I getting this right? Is that,
My motion was to put a period after views.
Okay.
Mayor Heffernan has said that he was willing to vote for all my change, or putting back all the GPAC language, except that he wanted to keep the language after the word views. Is that correct?
does
Right, that's
anyone address the consider on in the last in 5.1.7, or is that not included in?
That is included, yes.
Okay, but you include that in?
Yes,
But you did not include beyond on the above?
yes.
I would prefer to see both of them removed, I guess.
Well, okay, that's been consistent. Okay, so, to get some resolution, so if I reverted back to what you initially proposed, Mr. Rosansky,
Then it's
we'd have four.
Yes.
All right, we have four. Let's go.
Thank you.
Okay,
Compromise.
pages 15 through the middle of 17 deal with multifamily residential. And let me see if there were any significant changes here. I'm sorry, the doors? Yeah. Again, on page 16, the second bullet was comparable to the issue about the building box before for the single family. That was a consideration of the committee that the other aspects of this, the modulation, achieved that objective, was the input from the commission.
So the Plan Commission took out on bullet 2,
The third bullet.
I'm talking about
I'm
bullet.
sorry, took out the language at the end, yes, the singular building volume, I'm sorry. And then the Planning Commission recommended restoration of the language that the GPAC had deleted under ground floor treatment. The second, we're going to start lettering these for confusion, but it's the second round
Right.
bullet beneath the ground floor treatment about the pedestrians facing blank walls or looking into utility or parking spaces. That was restored by the commission. They felt that was an important consideration.
And I think for reference person, when you number these things, you've got to get away from bullets and diamonds, and you
Yeah,
just
go.
give it a number, give
We're
it a
gonna
letter.
letters.
Well, that's all right. It's just, because,
Yep.
this is the,
This is confusing.
well, it's not confusing, it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Can we hear what Nancy had to say about GPAC on that?
I don't remember exactly why we took that out.
I don't think that microphone is on.
No, it is now.
Oh.
I think it is.
It was.
It's not good.
You had it on.
Okay.
Good job, Mr. Burnham.
That's why he gets the big bucks.
I don't think, in this case, it's major. If you want to delete the one and add back the other, I don't think that there was a long discussion or anything of major significance to GPAC.
Okay. Okay, well, what's the council's opinion? Mr. Selich?
Well, I would just as soon leave the original language that GPAC had and add back in that one statement on, provide street and path facing elevations. I think that's probably a good thing to have.
So you like the way it was?
Yeah, I like the way it was. I like the way it was originally.
Okay. All right. We have a straw vote on that, so we can take care of that first chunk.
Did you add in the one that was crossed out by both?
Yes.
So Mr. Selich is adding in the third bullet.
Wait, which one was crossed
Under
out by
building elevations. Provide street and pathway facing elevations with high-quality doors, windows, moldings, and metalwork and finishes.
Sure, fine.
That
sounds good to me.
That's two.
I want to live next to one of those
How about this end? 4. We got 4. Okay. Okay, now the second chunk on 16. We don't have numbers, so we'll call it the chunk. How does council want to deal with this ground floor treatment?
Why did GPAC take that out? Is it just is that also, you don't remember? Okay.
Not all of our discussions are long and detailed.
Okay.
It may have been that they just thought it was more detail than was needed.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, that's 2. 3. All right? 3, 4. Okay. You have direction?
5.
Okay.
There were no real changes on page 17 to the balance of the policies for multifamily by either entity, either group. And then we went into the policies on page 17 through the middle of page 19 for commercial districts. On page 18, the deletion.
Wait. Before we jump on that, 5.2.1, the bottom of page 17, what would that mean? Architectural treatment of trash enclosures, if we strip it all away.
The intent, I believe, of the advisory committee on this was that trash enclosures should at least be attractively designed as a part of commercial buildings. So you might have walls or decorative screening or some other element that indeed, rather than just a bin sitting out there, that it's not enclosed.
Oh, no, listen, I build them, and you can have more than just a little, with gazebos on top and block walls. I mean, it's and stuccoed and with stone trim. I mean, is that kind of what people have in mind here? I mean, does this give you enough direction, going back to Mr. Seltz, does this give you enough direction to be able to deal with this 5 years from now? Having the term architectural treatment. Is that fine?
I think it does. There may be more
No, that's fine.
discussion as
That's
to
okay.
how much when we get an ordinance before the Planning Commission, but to me, this is saying, let's do something more than slats
Okay.
in the chain link fence.
Okay, good. Any other comment on that? Okay. Good. What do you-
On page 18, the deletion for the LEED certification, this is repeated in a number of other areas. We have policies and sustainability. The commission recommended deleting this particular one because the fact that the sense was that the policy itself about building design and site planning elements of reduced consumption of water, energy, and other non-renewable sources achieved that objective for the Planning Commission. LEED certification is a technical certification for meeting certain criteria and standards for energy, water, and renewable materials for buildings.
Plus, there's also a cost associated with that.
There is a
isn't there?
cost as well. They thought the more general approach was a more
And
I'm
they felt
against
that it
having
might
the leads
change
in
over
there.
time.
I'd
So you like the way it is?
I'd like
Delete
it
it.
struck out.
Struck out? Okay.
Struck out.
Struck out. 2,
Struck out.
3, 4, we're there. Okay?
Okay. Moving on to page 19. At the top of the page, the deletion is actually a technical deletion. It's not that the policy will not be considering. It was a policy pertaining to parking in commercial districts, and the consultant who is preparing the circulation element is preparing an entire section addressing parking, so it was felt that it was inappropriate to be included in this element. So it will come back for your consideration in another form in the circulation element. So this is not a rejection of the policy per se. They just want to consider it as a part of the circulation element.
So that was stricken by staff and not the planning commission?
We recommended, the staff recommended that it be stricken from this element, and the commission supported it.
And who's going to have the final say? It's going to come back in the circulation element?
Yes, it'll come back, and you'll see that at your next meeting in December, or at a meeting in December.
Okay.
Then on 523, the deletion or the recommendation and the change from the Planning Commission was to really change adequately, because there was some question about adequate, and basing this upon what is feasible rather than mandating what is adequate. Language change.
Okay.
Okay. And then the alley design was added by the GPAC vis-a-vis the consideration that the alleys be appropriately designed and suitable as well.
Anybody have any comments on that? Okay, 5.3.
Okay. The next section addresses mixed-use districts within the community. The 531 is policy addressing mixed-use buildings where housing and retail or office on the lower floor are integrated into the same structure. There are also policies 532, 533 dealing with the horizontal integration of these uses. The changes, again, were relatively minor. On page 20, you will see that the commission added the GPAC had added and clarified that retail and other non-residential uses language be added, because there are circumstances where the ground floor of a building might be an office use, not just strictly a retail, so that's why they broadened the category of non-residential uses in this category as well. And the commission added the word compatible, because they felt if any use is going to be in a mixed-use building, it should be compatible with the housing.
Does anybody have any comments on that?
I think compatible is a good addition there.
That's good. I guess I have one concern that doesn't seem to be addressed in this policy at all, and that is particularly becomes evident when you look at the examples that you have there. All of these are built on a 0 front yard setbacks, and there really isn't a whole lot of articulation in there, and there's no room for any landscaping other than what might be in the public sidewalk area, which in many portions of our town, we don't provide wide enough sidewalks to allow for adequate landscaping. So shouldn't there be a policy added that, again, provides for some portion of the property to be articulated to where there's some landscaping or open space available? And this is in the areas that we're looking at that will be combination residential and commercial. I think that you can have an awfully stark neighborhood to live in if you can't provide for some landscaping in those neighborhoods.
And I think that's a very valid point, and I think we can amplify the photographs. On the bottom of page 19, you will see the last bullet talks about incorporating extensive landscape appropriate to the location. Where we have urbanized streetscapes, it does require less landscape, but integrate landscape into the area. So this reflects that there is a difference in the areas in which you're located. There are some places where you may want, such as the airport area, an urbanized streetscape, and other places where you may not want an urbanized streetscape.
You do mention articulation and modulation of street phasing elevations to promote interest and character. Is there anything that we can do that says that we aren't going to have a 0 setback across the entire frontage of the property?
Well, there may be locations where you may desire, let me use an example, Cannery Village. You may desire that is a location that you want 0 setbacks. In other locations, you may want some setbacks. Obviously, the airport area, even though it's more urbanized, as we get to the airport area, you'll see that there are some provisions for that type. So it's going to vary by the location, I think.
Is there, what is the council's desire in this section?
Does the last part of 5.3.3 on page 20, does that answer your concern, starting with the word residential uses should be? Seems that kind of is getting to the point you're bringing up, if I'm reading it right.
I agree that it does say landscape, but it really,
And it goes on
I
to
guess
say
I
they
get-
should
I
not
get
be
more into
completely
the-
isolated by walls or other design elements, which
Yeah.
implies that landscape would be the alternative.
well, I think that if you tie that in with the next section, which talks about articulation, I'd like to see some articulation shown in that one policy on integrating housing and non-residential uses along the front of the property, that which is facing the street. But that's something that neither GPAC or the Planning Commission have really discussed.
Okay. I think, let me just, maybe it's confusing the way that this has been structured a little bit. This, on 533, these are locations in which housing, multifamily housing, mixed use, and/or retail might be separately integrated into a cohesive area, such as the areas on what I call the backside of Mariner's Mile, the inland side of Mariner's Mile. And in this case, all of those other policies that we've addressed earlier on a commercial structure, which talk about articulation and modulation, or a multifamily would pertain in addition to this. So this is just really addressing how they're tied together. So all those other policies would still be applicable that we've been walking through.
Okay, so your recommendation is we don't change this?
I think we need to refer back to the other policies would pertain, so there's no confusion about that, because then that may address your issue.
All right. What's the council's pleasure on this?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Dick?
Good to me.
My just one comment, and that is, if we end up with areas where, I understood Cannery Village was somewhat like that, where the downstairs using it as retail is not what people want to do. They want to actually make the whole place their residence. Are we not just fighting City Hall? We're not going to be able to do that with reasonability. We're just going to create a mishmash.
What
Why are
was
we-
your thought process if somebody wants to use the commercial downstairs for residential?
Under the Cannery Village, we allow the ground floors to be used for residential completely, and we only require mixed use, i.e. the ground floor to be retail at the street intersections for the Cannery Village area.
Okay, now, in the rest of these multiple uses, is there a restriction on residential downstairs?
In some areas, yes, and in some areas, no, depending
Okay, so
upon the area.
it will
As
be
we
looked
get
at from the
specific areas.
standpoint of what is best for the planned
Yes.
residential area.
Yes, because for certain areas, for example, we require retail at the ground floor for continuity.
Okay, so Dick, I guess the answer to the question is that it's going to be determined on a case-by-case basis depending on how the new developments occur.
Or
But
on a district by
my only
district.
question
District by
is if
district.
we're writing this in ahead of time and saying, oh, you can only rent it like this, and the guy then he puts up a facade there and uses it for a home anyway, how are you going to enforce that, Don?
That's why we have our code enforcement people. Okay, let's go on to the next item.
Okay, the next page deals with, on page 21, deals with the principles vis-à-vis what we call pedestrian districts. Now, this may be in some cases, this may apply to a commercial district, which is 100% commercial, like a Corona Del Mar, or areas in which the intent is to have a pedestrian character, such as Cannery Village, where it may be a mix of housing and commercial. The change in the second bullet was requested by the Planning Commission to clarify. There was a lack of understanding what finished floor meant. And so the intent of the language change there was really, not, and this wasn't a real deviation from the GPAC, to just clarify what the first floor, what the finished floor meant. So it's a definition. The parking policy was changed. The deletion of the latter statement about shall not be visible from residential streets was changed, as you see here.
What was the thought process of structured parking not being visible from residential? Why was that removed? Seems like to me that's a pretty important thing. If I were a single-family residence and I was butting up to commercial property, I really wouldn't want to look at a parking structure. Was that the GPAC's thought process too, I guess?
I don't know that we commented on it.
No, you didn't
specifically.
comment, no. The GPAC had retained the original language.
Okay, so
I
they
think
agreed with
the
that.
Planning Commission felt that you might not be able to accomplish this in every case.
I don't think you can accomplish it in most cases. I mean, most of our residential neighborhoods are so close to the commercial areas that virtually any parking structure you're going to build in town, except for maybe like an airport area or something, is going to be
I agree
visible
with-
from a
yeah.
residential neighborhood.
I agree with the Planning Commission and appreciate their practical outlook.
I mean, certainly it's something you got to take into consideration when we build one, but like, let's say we wanted to build one, we've talked about building one like on that public parking lot behind Banderas. Under that policy, you could forget about it. I mean, you'd never get any kind of extra parking in Corona Del Mar
Yeah,
on the peninsula or
the whole of Corona
Anywhere
Del
where
Mar
we
has
need it.
open parking behind it that's visible from the residents, and how would you hide that?
I don't agree. I mean, I agree with the Planning Commission deletion there.
Okay, Mr. Selich, what's your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I agree with the Planning Commission.
So this is
Leslie, you agree with the
strike
Planning Commission, and Dick, do you
it.
please?
Strike it is what we're
Okay.
saying, just like it is there.
Okay, we agree with the Planning Commission.
On the next page, 22, and to the very top of page 23, again, policies on character regarding the design of office and business parks. Two components, 541 addressing site planning, and the 542 dealing with the development form and architecture. The first really deals more of the concepts of sort of campus business parks. The change of the first bullet by the Planning Commission was intended to not mandate in all cases that the buildings actually had to face one another. They felt that facing the common courtyards and pedestrian open spaces, et cetera, was a more appropriate definition as well. And the second change, and the bullet change, the change for the second bullet was an error in language, and none of us quite understood what it meant as originally written.
Anybody have any comments on that? Okay, let's go forward to the next item then.
Okay.
All right, I assume that we're approving the wording that the Planning
per the
Commission made it
Planning
down.
Yep. Okay, our next section gets into the beginnings of the discussion of the neighborhoods, districts, and corridors of the city. The first section, beginning on page 24, running through the middle of page 25, deals with the category of public and institutional uses as well. Again, you will see most of the language changes here are relatively minor. The broadened, you'll see the terminology of hospitals, for example, was changed from medical facilities. And the one policy that was referred to that was deleted earlier in the section where we had the land use classifications, if you take a look at 6.1.2, if you remember, the language that was struck earlier was the statement about public uses, and I'm going to generalize, could be basically located anywhere. This is where the policy language occurs, and you can see how the language was modified by the Planning Commission in this location.
Okay, any comments from the council?
Excuse
I'd
me?
like to make a broad one, and that is that the closest thing I think we have to mixed use is over in Corona Del Mar, and that's developed over many years, and it's worked out pretty well. It was considered to be architecturally one of the finest communities, old Corona Del Mar, from Mexico to the Canadian border, has the highest of everything, as far as land values and those. Why are we trying to remake the world? Why don't we go with things that we know that have worked in our communities rather than, we're looking at some of these newer communities, and many of the areas that had newer communities in in the back east are slums. I mean, they just turned into slums overnight. And bam, 5 years later, they had to tear down the buildings. They were so bad. So why don't we kind of do what we've seen and what's worked in our areas now?
It's very, well, we're now discussing the public and institutional uses in districts. Do we have any comments to whether we go with the Planning Commission or GPAC, or does GPAC have any comments related to the changes?
No, these are minor.
Okay, I recommend we go forward with the Planning Commission.
Just a language thing here, I don't understand. 6.11 talks about religious, in the second line, religious facilities, schools, cultural.
Facilities.
Okay, so there's a word missing there? Huh? Let's accommodate schools, government, administrative, and operational facilities, fire stations and police facilities, religious facilities, schools, cultural.
Facilities.
Okay, so I said, is there a word missing there?
Add in facilities, okay.
Yeah.
Other than that, no other changes?
I
Okay.
have a question on policy 6.1.4. Was the intent of this section to assume that all school and utility districts and other governmental agencies are exempt, because they're not in all cases? So or was it to say if, to the extent they are exempt, then we would encourage them? So one way to maybe change that might be to say governmental agencies that may be exempt.
Instead of are.
Okay, let's go forward to the next item, residential neighborhoods.
The next section on residential neighborhoods and the policies beginning on page 26 address basically three principal types of topics, dealing first with the supply and diversity of the housing product that would be accompanied within the city of Newport Beach. It addresses the policy on 622, which was originally listed as 3 here, about policy regarding the rebuilding of units. And then the policies address specific areas of concern, such as home occupations, care facilities, manufactured housing, private open spaces, and gated communities. You will see in here the major changes. The GPAC, and I would probably defer to Nancy to explain this one, had recommended the deletion, because we had a tough time explaining it to the Planning Commission the other night, had recommended deletion of the policy on 6.2.9 or 8. I'm going to have to check that numbering because that's incorrect, but that policy that is listed as 6.2.19 on page 27, they had deleted the policy on mobile home parks on encouraging the maintenance and preservation. The Planning Commission did request to restore that language. You will see also the last policy on the page, 6.2.10, the committee wanted to discourage the use of new private entry gates in existing neighborhoods versus prohibition, which was the original language.
Nancy, do you have a comment on the mobile home park issue?
Just that there was a feeling that the area is changing, that we were for affordable housing, of course, felt that new kind of housing would probably go in there, but didn't know why we had to encourage mobile homes in particular. We just felt it was irrelevant. They could be there or not be there, but we didn't have to encourage it.
Okay. Council, do you have any thoughts on that? I'm not hearing anything. Do we go with the Planning Commission or GPAC?
Both of them are crossing out the 6219, the first part, right?
Well, the first part really is crossed out by GPAC, and the highlighted is adding that very same wording back in by the Planning Commission. So that we need to make a determination, are we going to go with GPAC or are we going to go with the Planning Commission? Mr. Selich? Or, Mr. Nichols, which one do you want?
Well, I have maybe I have an addition to the yellow language here, the Planning Commission language. and just insert a word, encourage the maintenance and preservation of existing high-quality and safe mobile home housing. To recognize that we do have that type of housing in town,
Why don't we
but maybe not really.
encouraging going to the modular housing, which is mobile home housing?
That's the next statement, which is manufactured housing.
But
Well,
does not a modular housing, does that mean something slightly different? Because it qualifies in mobile home parks.
I think that policy does that because the second part of it says encourage the revitalization of mobile home parks in need of substantial rehab, and changing from coaches to the modular units is one way of revitalizing.
But if we were to say, encourage the revitalization to modular home parks, or modular housing home parks, that would be, and then what I'm referring to is modular housing basically doesn't have a frame under it with wheels, and the trailers do. And if we can encourage them to go to modular housing, we will improve the neighborhoods markedly.
I think we call it manufactured housing rather than modular, but, okay, so your suggestion, Councilman Rosansky, is...
Before we go there, pardon me for maybe being a little dense. Nancy, could you explain once again why they wanted that language deleted?
I think that simply there just wasn't a lot of enthusiasm for
mobile homes.
parks.
So it was
Yeah.
more antipathy towards mobile homes.
Not for, in fact, that area where, several areas where there are mobile homes have been encouraged. I mean, we're encouraging affordable housing, so it wasn't that aspect of it. It was more just that maybe something nicer.
So they don't
And
want
I
to
realize some mobile homes are very nice, I know.
So the idea was to maybe conversion of mobile home parks to other types of affordable housing.
Okay, well, we need to move forward. Are we going to go?
I say go with the
Commission,
planning
or-
commission, but insert the word existing. Preservation of existing high-quality and safe mobile home housing.
Okay. I would
What
agree
about,
with that.
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Maybe I'm a little not following this. What about in terms of having more manufactured homes in a mobile home park? I mean, what do you think about that, Nancy? Would that be...
Is there a way to move toward that? Do you see how to write this out?
I don't think that we have, according to
really-
state regulations, the ability to regulate that.
Okay.
And I don't think this is a major issue. I mean, we
Right.
did discuss it, but obviously there are much more important
Okay,
issues that
so we need to move
oral
forward.
about.
I would accept Councilman Rosansky's, Mr. Ed Selich, Rosansky,
Fine.
what are you two?
That's fine.
Okay.
This is to leave it in.
To leave it in as highlighted, except after the, say, preservation of, and then add in the word existing. Okay, let's go. Next item would be,
Okay, now we're going to move on to the various land use districts. As Ms. Wood indicated, the commission was able to address one of those. It was relatively lengthy, and we took it a little bit out of order for Councilmember Daigle being here tonight. So let me move you to page
48.
48. And let me give you a brief overview of the airport area in terms of the policies. This is, again, a fairly lengthy session. I should also indicate that because of the special considerations, as have been discussed by the council, as well as the commission and the GPAC before, about the concerns by the council member about the concerns that if indeed housing is going to be a suitable use within this area, there was indeed the direction to take a look at how best to integrate those uses to create whole neighborhoods, to create quality development, to avoid the conflicts that could occur within that area. And at the council's direction, in addition to the work that we have been performing on this, a very well-qualified urban design firm, Roma Design, who represented by Walter Last, right behind me, was retained to indeed work on some of the policies and the recommendations and guidelines that you see in here. And I'm going to ask Walter in a second to address the council to some of the basic principles here, but let me give you a relatively brief overview of the recommendations. First is the recognition on page 48 and running over into the next few pages of the distinct differences in here. And actually, Councilmember Solich, if I could ask you to turn down the lights on this one as well so we understand as well. Basically, it divides the airport into a number of sub-area districts. Basically, what the plan indicates is that there are a couple of key commercial nodes. You have the auto dealers, you have on Bristol some of the commercial uses, a key number of what you'll refer to on page, page 51 as commercial nodes. It then creates policy for the balance of the area shown in the sort of the cross-hatched red area. And in here, it really gives a property owner or developer two options. One is to develop uses on the site as under the current policies and regulations of the community vis-a-vis office or airport supporting uses as well, and emphasize the support of those kinds of uses. Secondarily, it says, however, if a property owner or a developer wishes to take some of the properties and to develop residential within these areas, beginning on page 51 and running through basically the balance of the section up to page 56, are the basic guidelines of policies by which residential would be accommodated within this area. The premise is that if residential was to be incorporated in the area, and the objective is to create cohesive residential villages, one of the concerns was if a person came in and, let's say, only developed 1 acre of land, that 1 acre of land, there's no guarantee that the other areas would also be developed for housing, and you could have a fragment that could be adversely impacted and negatively impacted by the surrounding uses or vice versa over time with the surrounding area. So some of the basic principles you'll see in here is about how cohesive residential villages can be created. Another topic that was addressed in here was that any residential within these areas would be accommodated outside of the 65 CNEL. And Mr. Burnham, I believe, has provided some languages, and we can come back to that in a moment. But the notation was that these are the two lines. There is the 1985 line on there are two lines that delineate the 65 CNEL. The outer line is the line that is the 1985 line. The inner line here, you can see there's a fairly substantial difference of these two boundaries, is the interior line is from the settlement agreement from the city as well. It's been airport policy, again, Mr. Burnham can address, to basically not allow residential within the 65 CNEL. This is also a diagram, I should indicate, is an illustrative diagram. This is a diagram that indicates and is incorporated in your document showing the principles about how residential villages could be created around a focal point that creates a centerpiece for neighborhood. And this is a community park of about, or neighborhood park of about 1 acre in size that creates a place around which the housing can be or could be oriented. This, though, I should indicate the boundaries of this were based upon looking at sites that had opportunities based upon ownership or interest being expressed by the property owners for development. It was not saying that this would be the only location in which housing would be permitted, because the policy of the plan would allow the housing within any of these areas outside of the 65 CNEL. So this is intended to be an illustrative diagram illustrating the relationships among these parcels as well. There are various phases discussed here with this as well, and I will show how, for example, we have the illustration around the parks. And this is an example of how in another community, and unfortunately we don't have photographs of Newport Beach to illustrate a comparable in this particular case, about how a higher density development has been similarly grouped around about a 1 acre park, comparable to that as suggested here, and how the units relate to that from a relational standpoint. Maybe I can ask Mr. Rast to sort of further elaborate upon some of the policies here for the airport area.
Good afternoon. I'm Walter Rask with Roma Design Group. We were engaged by the city to zoom in effect, on the airport area and study the feasibility of residential development there in a way that would realize some broader objectives of the community. To emphasize, the drawing that you see here is illustrative and used both for analytical purposes and also to describe one way that the area might develop given the policies that are recommended in this document. What we did to get to this point was to talk to property owners and take a look at the intensity of existing development in the area and identify what we call opportunity sites, sites that either property owners were interested in developing in residential or residential mixed use, or where it was apparent that they're, well, certainly if they're vacant and or if they're very low intensity uses that would economically be potentially redeveloped and redeveloped with a small r. If we assume that all of those areas are developed at an average density of 50 units an acre, which would be very typical for this kind of a location, given our experience in other communities, that could accommodate the 4,300 unit number that was originally referenced here. In the conversation at the Planning Commission the other day, we had an extensive discussion about these two noise contours. I won't get into the technical aspects of those, but the critical thing is that if the city chooses to allow housing between those two lines, the Airport Land Use Commission is obligated to disapprove that, but the city has an opportunity to override that determination if they feel that that's in its best interest. So we did estimate that, and I should add that the Planning Commission felt that that was inappropriate to allow housing between those two lines, and that led to the discussion of allowing instead 3,300 units rather than the 4,300 units that had originally been proposed. I'm sorry, did you have a question? Okay. Now, moving on then, as Mr. Tesher said, one of the objectives here is to avoid a situation where you might have a few low-density, scattered residential developments in the area that end up not adding up to cohesive neighborhoods. In an effort to get cohesive neighborhoods, we identified opportunities for 4 locations focused on a public open space, at least 1 acre in area, and those are identified in green on the plan. And in order to ensure that, or to create a mechanism to have this open space developed as part of the residential development, we set a minimum acreage of 10 acres for the first phase of development in a neighborhood, and it would be the obligation of that 10-acre development to provide the open space that would serve a larger neighborhood as it grew. This is not an onerous requirement by any means, because the Parkland Dedication Ordinance requires a fair amount, 3 or 4 times as much land or in lieu fees for a development of that scale. So there is an opportunity cost, of course, but from a dollar standpoint, it's not in any sense onerous on those developments. And the third aspect recommended here is that there be a minimum average density within the first phase, that 10-acre phase, of 50 units per acre, which would be a little bit less than the illustration that Mr. Tesher just showed a minute ago. Typically, 4 units of housing over one level of parking will net out at about 50 to 60 units per acre. So this is one possible form it could take, but it could also be a combination of lower density housing types such as townhouses.
Can you explain, please,
mid-rise or high-rise.
if you go back to your first phase density, what's kind of the philosophy behind that, how you came up with that?
Well, the first reason for setting any kind of a minimum is to get a critical mass of development in an area so that it can support neighborhood-serving uses, most obvious of which in this context is the neighborhood park. If initial phase of development were much smaller, 2, 3, 5 acres, it would be an unreasonable burden to require an acre or even a half acre dedication of park, because it would be disproportionate with the scale of development being proposed there. I will say that the second aspect of this is that that we recognize that it's not going to be feasible in every case to actually aggregate 10 acres of land. And so this recommendation here sets up an alternative way of meeting the intent, if not the letter, of the policies that are recommended in here. But just to finish the response to the question on a minimum density, so it is to try and get a jump start, if you will, on each of the 4 neighborhoods, and to create a critical mass of development to support these neighborhood uses. And we don't feel that the density is unreasonable because it is what you're most likely to see, given our experience in other locations such as San Diego or North San Jose, or even what the Irvine Business Complex is looking at. We don't put anywhere near as high a minimum on subsequent development because we want to encourage a variety of housing types meeting a different lifestyles and different price points as well. The alternative I'm sorry?
If I could just add one more thought to that reason for the 10 acres and the 50-unit average density. If you'll recall from when we looked at the traffic model runs on the alternatives that GPAC had prepared a few months ago, we assumed that with residential being introduced to the airport area, that this would become a true mixed-use area where you would have the possibility of people walking to their jobs or walking to the local retail and service businesses in the area. And because of that, we assumed that there would be a 10% reduction in trip generation, which was a conservative assumption based on the studies in the field. But in order to feel that that's still a valid assumption, that was another one of the reasons that we felt that we needed to have a critical mass for a residential village in this area.
Thanks. Sorry I forgot to mention that. That's a very important point. The alternative method, and this is particularly applicable to the neighborhood on the lower right, which is at the intersection of Quail and Spruce Streets. Because of the fragmented nature of the land ownership in that area, sites are, there's a couple that are just under 1 acre, and I don't think there's anything more than about 3 or 4 acres in that area. We recommend an alternative mechanism, because the sense was it was just an impossible burden to require developers to somehow aggregate their land either through purchase or some agreement among themselves. So instead what we've said is that a developer can come in and avoid the requirement for the minimum 10 acres, avoid the requirement for the minimum 50 units an acre, avoid the requirement for the minimum 1 acre neighborhood park if, as part of their application, they submit what we're calling a concept plan that looks at the larger neighborhood. Not that they have any control over what their neighbors would do, but merely to illustrate how their proposed development might fit into a larger neighborhood and how their proposed development would contribute towards the realization of the policies that are set forth in the recommendations. So, for example, to the extent that this drawing shows linkages, either vehicular or pedestrian, to break down block size and to improve circulation in the area, it would behoove them to show how their project is helping to the realization of those, without making an explicit requirement that they have to actually provide those pieces. So it's a much easier standard to meet within those areas, but it'll be enough to create an incentive and an illustration of how the neighborhood might develop over time. Now, the area on the west is kind of a bit of one and the other. If the residential development is permitted in the larger area, that is to say that the noise contour on the left is what controls, it is possible easily to meet a standard of 10 acres, 1 acre park, minimum density, because of the size, particularly of the Commerce Plaza site that Mr. Tesher is pointing at right now. However, if the determination is that residential is not appropriate in that area, of necessity, any residential development in that area is going to have to use this alternative mechanism, which looks at creating a concept plan for an overall neighborhood to show how that a smaller piece might contribute to the larger whole. On the other two sides, there really isn't an issue. You've got a very large parcel, 25 acres, where the Connexent facility is, and the Cole property has opportunities for infill development on the parking lots surrounding the commercial buildings there. And then at the top is the, keep forgetting the name of that, Cole Limited Editions. Actually, it has another name, and that, I think they changed it. Anyway, the larger block on the top there is, I believe, is 15 acres, and that provides a ready opportunity for doing this larger scale integrated development. And we've heard that a developer is actually in the process of assembling that property in order to pursue this kind of development. That concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
I got a couple of questions. Did I understand you correctly that you said that all of the yellow areas, if they were developed with housing at 50 to the acre, that they would take the 4,300 units?
Yes, that's correct.
So that means that all of the existing buildings would go down in that area, or these would supplement existing buildings? What exactly does that mean?
It's a mixture of the two. On the Cole property, essentially everything to the upper right of MacArthur, well, with the exception of Connexent, that would be infill development where residential development would replace parking that was there, and then Cole would have to either incorporate additional parking into that residential development or would have to build parking structures to replace the parking lots. The balance of the areas are replacing existing uses. And, well, for the most part, there are a couple of vacant lots in there, but for the most part, it's replacing existing low-intensity uses. Again, this is not prescriptive. Those existing uses have the right to remain. If the property owners want to redevelop them, they're free to do that under existing zoning and non-residential purposes. All that's being offered here is an opportunity to redevelop land for residential purposes if it meets certain policies.
Okay, and then you indicated that, I think, that the Planning Commission was not in favor of anything between the two noise lines for residential
That is
purposes?
correct. That is correct.
Okay, and then...
Mr. Selledge, I would just add a little bit to the noise line thing. I think the Planning Commission felt that it was more prudent for the city in our land use element to refer to the 65 CNEL noise contour that is in the airport environs land use plan. And if we did that with the current line, that would take out Commerce Plaza and some of those other properties from residential consideration. However, I don't think they were saying that we should change the map. They still wanted to allow for the future possibility of residential development in that area should new studies change the location of the line, should airport operations change, the line moves, technology may change. So it was a little bit of a hybrid.
Okay, well, thanks for that clarification.
Sharon?
I got one more. But you're interrupting me. I forgot what it was.
May I also, Councilmember Sulich, for clarification, the commission, even with that possibility, did vote to reduce the capacity by 1,000 residential units as a total capacity for the area, to go back again to revert to the original GPAC recommendation for a number basis.
Okay, yeah, I picked that point up. I guess my last question is, typically, what is the maximum CNEL level that single-family, or I shouldn't say single-family, but residential developments are allowed in? Is it anything outside 65? I mean, is that typically the, for all types of noise, whether it's airplane noise, freeway noise, et cetera, 65 is the dividing line?
The 65 is the dividing line. It's considered a normally unacceptable use under the State Office of Noise Control.
Okay, thanks.
Don, let's Councilman Dale.
With that line, though, I think our former city attorney, Bob Burnham, can really talk extensively about this because, for a number of reasons. First, our community interacts with this airport. It's a very important issue, has a lot of other overtones and so on. So I want him to address that. And one aspect of these lines, though, is that this county line, even though it is 65, it doesn't necessarily reflect the true noise conditions, and that the assumptions that it was based on were lots of 767. So the real noise environment of 65 may be closer to our line. But if our former city attorney can really delve into this issue, I would appreciate it.
Should I delve, Mayor?
Give us guidance.
All right.
Yes.
As Councilmember Daigle indicated, there are two 65 CNEL lines up on the board here. The outer line is one that was adopted by the Airport Land Use Commission back in 1985. It was based, as the little handout indicates, on assumed flight levels, fleet mix, and operational levels over a 20-year period. And those assumptions were based on EIR 232, which is the environmental impact report the county prepared in conjunction with the 1985 JWA master plan process. And as Councilmember Daigle indicated, that line does not reflect the existing 65 CNEL. In fact, the existing line is referred to as the settlement agreement line on this diagram, and that does reflect the current 65 CNEL based upon, and I say current, probably the line based upon data accumulated by the airport over the last 6 months, and probably reflects the CNEL 3 months ago. So the existing 65 CNEL is the interior line, and the exterior or the outside line is based upon kind of a fictional assumption that is approximately 20 years old. But the state law requires the Airport Land Use Commission, in fact, to adopt an airport noise land use compatibility plan that does make assumptions and provide for the orderly growth of the airport or growth of operations over a 20-year period. So the Airport Land Use Commission in 1985 had to do that. The amendment that is being considered by the City Council, probably for submittal to the electorate, will have to go to the Airport Land Use Commission as it relates to land within, I think it's called the area of influence in the A-loop. So it will be submitted to the Airport Land Use Commission, and they would make a determination as to whether the plan that is approved by the council and or voters is consistent with the A-loop. If it is not, the City Council does have the authority to override, as the Speaker was indicating, but you cannot override unless you make certain findings that are required by state law dealing with the purposes of the Airport Land Use Compatibility Plan in the first place. So if you find that the amendments that you approve are consistent with those purposes, then you can override the determination of inconsistency by the Airport Land Use Commission. I think one interesting part of the contours is you'll notice a bulge in both the existing and the 1985 contour in the vicinity of Bristol. And as my handout indicates, that's a result of the general aviation flight pattern. General aviation aircraft that are able to use the shorter of the two runways during the non-peak commercial hours make a fairly sharp left turn and get into what's called the GA pattern. And that accounts for this little bulge in this area. The city has generally considered general aviation operations to be a good thing and a deterrent to expanded air carrier operations. So one consideration is the impact of putting residential land use in an area that is overflown by GA aircraft. Obviously, the existing bulge is very limited. That is, GA aircraft really don't move out the contour very much based upon the existing aircraft and the existing operational levels. I think that's a function of the fact that more and more GA aircraft are business jets, higher powered aircraft that use the main air carrier runway, and you're seeing fewer and fewer of the smaller GA aircraft using the traditional GA pattern. I think it's fair to say that that pattern is expected to continue in the future. So while theoretically there could be an impact on GA operations by putting residential in that area, as a practical matter, unless there's a change in the trends, that would not be the case.
Another question for you. Planning Commissioner Larry Tucker and myself, or actually Larry came up with this language, and I kind of want to run this by you, and really the spirit of it is to be inconsistent with the Airport Land Use Commission, the A-Loop, but also provide ourselves with the same local control and the same rights that we currently have, and that would be able to override, and I know Councilmember Webb is familiar with that process, override the commission if we wanted to at some future date. So the spirit being we want to get our general plan consistent, but also give ourselves some flexibility. And so that language is along the lines of, after page 56, talking about the 65 dBA CNEL line, which would use the A-loop, that the location of residential uses are consistent with the A-loop unless the City Council makes the findings for override required by state law.
I think that's good language.
Okay, so that wouldn't create difficulties with our airport issues?
I don't think it would. Mr. Murphy yesterday indicated a very strong preference that the city become a conforming agency and have its general plan consistent with the A-Loop. In a conversation with him today, I think he still has a preference for that, but did not indicate that it would be a major impediment to reaching agreement on the sphere opportunities.
Okay, thanks.
Question there, Bob. You said this plan, the A-Loop, the big one, was supposed to be consistent with a 20-year plan, and it was adopted in 1985.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
85 plus 20 is 205. We're at that point.
We are.
Okay, so basically my comment is that the 65 dB line that is consistent with that development at this point, why could that not be adopted? We expect quieter airplanes. They're flying well over the number of what we thought were going to be the planes that coming out of our airport. In other words, we got 150 going out, and we expected probably 100 or something like that because of the noise problems. Why wouldn't we be in a better position to go for the smaller line and to basically say that basically we believe we have to hold that? If we go to the much bigger CNEL line, we're going to affect a lot of our community if they build it. I mean, if they allow the airport to expand back to that.
Well, I'm not sure I totally understand your question.
Our community has grown accustomed to a much smaller 65 line than was originally assumed. And this is over a period of time it's grown accustomed to that. That's what we have with the existing 65 line. If we were to adopt that and say that we believe we should be able to use that line, the 20 years has passed, this is what your growth is, it looks like it's consistent with that. If you maintain the airport as is, or, relatively as is, which is what they've said they do, why would we not be in a position to do that?
Dick, we don't adopt the 65 CNEL line. The city certainly could, in its noise element, say this is the existing or current 65 CNEL as of a particular date and time. What you are saying in large part, if you permit residential land use in the area between the current 65 and the
Right.
1985 CNEL line, is that, yes, you're really adopting that current line for purposes of land use planning. So I think that's the direction that I believe Councilmember Daigle and maybe others would like to go. It doesn't establish the line right there, but it does indicate that you are using that line for purposes of airport planning.
And it seems to indicate that that's our position as a city, too, doesn't it? I mean,
Yes.
as far as, I mean, we're taking an official position in that regard.
I think the city's official position are the terms and conditions of the 2002 John Wayne Airport Settlement Agreement amendments.
But did you not say, or have I not heard, that that settlement agreement doesn't have that noise line in?
The settlement agreement does not reference a CNEL contour.
So basically, by adopting a contour, we're not we're not opposing that agreement that we've adopted or abridging it in any way, is my understanding.
What you are doing, if you adopt a contour related to airport operations, you're getting into an area where the city has little or no legal authority. And I would encourage you not to adopt a 65 CNEL contour for purposes of airport operations. The settlement agreement does contain provisions that prevent the city, SPON, or airport working group from taking any action that would interfere with or impede the implementation of the improvements that are authorized in the settlement agreement. So that, and by establishing in the general plan a line that's different than the A-Loop 65, you arguably could be pushing that envelope. So I would encourage you not to adopt a 65 CNEL line per se, but I think based upon what I've heard from the airport director, while he is not thrilled with the notion of residential between the existing and the 1985 contour, he's not violently opposed to it either.
Bob, why would we not want to push at the Airport Land Use Commission to adopt the 65 CNEL based upon the latest readings of a few months ago?
Well, because those readings change. There is still a relatively small increase in operations permitted by the settlement agreement. As I've just indicated, if you take some action which the county could reasonably interpret as impeding or interfering with their implementation of the additional gates, service level increases, or flight increases authorized by the settlement agreement, then you're in violation of that agreement, and one option available to the county is to declare the city to be in breach.
But is that 65 CNEL based upon a single flight, or is it based upon multiple flights?
It's based upon all of the air carrier operations and general aviation operations at the airport, but, and I'm not a noise expert, I have been told repeatedly that the noisier aircraft that utilize the airport currently, the MD-80s, and there's, I think, 5 or 6 MD-80 operations, and I think it's the A300 that FedEx operates for cargo purposes. Those very few flights tend to establish the 65 CNEL contour. The contour is also in part predicated upon the number of Class A or relatively noisy air carrier operations. And then I've been told that the quieter air carrier operations really don't move the contour much at all. So it really is a contour established primarily by the number of the noisiest air carrier aircraft that operate at the facility. And since those MD-80s and similar equipment can operate up to the 87 ADD level, if you were to adopt a 65 CNEL contour, you would essentially be saying the MD-80s could not operate at any greater frequency than they currently operate. And that would be something that I think the air carriers, the airport, and others would probably object to.
I think I need to clarify something about this diagram. The smaller noise contour is not the existing CNEL. It is the 65 CNEL out of the settlement agreement EIR for the alternative that was approved as part of the settlement agreement.
Correct. And that line assumed a certain level of operations by a certain type of fleet, that is, a certain mix of commercial air carrier aircraft. Those assumptions, I think, have proven to be true, but if, as I just indicated, American Airlines or Alaska, each of which operates an MD-80, have MD-80s in their fleet, were to change equipment at this airport, that line can move and become closer to the 1985 contour. So we're fortunate to have an airport that has a relatively short runway that is best suited for operations by 737-800s and 700s and by 757s, as opposed to an MD-80. So, but that can change depending upon economic considerations, and as you know, the air carriers are not doing particularly well these days. So that's something always to keep in mind, is that the existing 65 CNEL contour can move back and forth depending upon the type of equipment that's operating at the airport.
So what you seem to be saying, though, that if we try to correct what we might see as a fictional line, that would be seen as a kind of an aggressive act and probably not something we want to do.
Yes, it would be seen as an aggressive act by, I think, the airport director. It may be seen as an aggressive act by the air carriers, the FAA, and people that do play a role in approving settlement agreements, people that play a role in potentially filing legal challenges to those agreements. So I think, we've talked recently about the complexity of the airport issue. This is an area that the city really shouldn't be dabbling in.
But there is precedent, as we said, that this is in a settlement agreement now, right? I mean, the smaller area.
No. This contour is one that was predicted to exist in EIR 582. EIR 582 was the document prepared by the city and county jointly to look at the impacts of increasing the maximum permitted noise levels of Class A departures and of increasing passengers and flight levels. So that line is not an existing line, although I think it's very close to the existing line. It's based, like the outside line, on a set of assumptions in terms of the type of aircraft.
I do understand that, but the actual existing line does not exceed that. It's actually within it.
The actual existing line, it's my understanding, is within this line, although almost identical to it.
Yes. And that line has both, it predicted, it was a predicted line that they are living with, and we have allowed growth, and they are extended their number of flights dramatically, and because of the quieter aircraft not causing the line to grow, it isn't going to grow unless they go back to a line of aircraft that is not really going to, I don't know whether that's continuing to be produced even right now, isn't it? Didn't they shut down that line?
Yeah, the MD-80s are not currently in production, and the MD-80 is not a particularly good aircraft for this airport, given the runway length needs on departure and the seat configuration, but still it's an aircraft that any air carrier operating at this facility could operate. And so I'm not quite sure where you're going, but if an air carrier wanted, they could introduce equipment that would cause the assumed line in the 2002 EIR to move closer to the existing or the 1985 line.
Yeah.
This line can move depending upon equipment decisions by air carriers, and those equipment decisions are not within the control of the city or the county. As long as they're Stage 3 aircraft, they can operate at this facility.
I do understand that, but if people were to do that, then they would be limiting the extent that the airport can be used themselves.
I don't believe that is true.
Mr. Mayor, can we get back to discussing the policies?
Well, what I'd like to do is, add some language that would not be seen as hostile by the airport director, wouldn't create difficulty with the airport, and yet we would be able to retain our local land use rights in terms of overriding the commission, as Irvine, Santa Ana does, and trying to achieve consistency with our land use with the A-loop. And so the language was crafted by Planning Commissioner Larry Tucker, and it has been vetted by the former city attorney, and that would be on page 56 under airport compatibility. After the 65 dBA CNEL line, which we've agreed to recognize as the county's line, the A-loop line, is to add the language that the location of residential uses are consistent with the A-loop unless the city council makes the findings for override required by state law.
Sounds all right to me.
Mr. Burnham, do you think that'll fly?
Pardon the pun. Yes, I do.
Well, that's the point. We've got other things going on with the county right now, and it's not the time to stick our foot through the door if in fact that's going to impede that.
I don't believe that language will interfere with our discussions with the county concerning sphere opportunities.
That's good. That's okay. Mr. Selvich?
I'm okay with that.
Can you repeat the wording, Leslie?
And I think Sharon has a copy of it, too. We also ran it by her. And there would be the location of residential uses are consistent with the A-loop unless the city council makes the findings for override required by state law.
Now, that would be in 6.15.24.
Right here.
So that would come after the word plan.
No, it come after.
Or after the CNEL. Then you would add a sentence that says what?
And that the location of residential uses are consistent with the A-loop unless the city council makes the findings for override required by state law.
All right, let's move on.
All right. Go ahead.
Did we have any other comments related to changes by the Planning Commission? Like on page 51, the Planning Commission recommended adding in for a waiver projects of at least 5 acres, or changing the 10-acre minimum requirement to 5 acres in some cases. Was there a reason to change that from what had been set up?
Maybe I can explain the commission recommendation here. The original wording was the 10-acre requirement may be waived, and it did not specify a minimum area. The commission felt that 5 acres was a absolute minimum to accommodate the capacities or the thresholds of size that Mr. Rask referred to. And that was the addition of the Planning Commission.
Where are you?
I'm sorry, page 51, middle of the page, policy 615.10.
I had another question. We received a letter from Brookfield Homes, and it made reference to 4 points. Could you address each of those points, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. In reference to this change that the Planning Commission recommended, this really would, frankly, frustrate this alternative approach to allowing residential development in the area, and it's directly relevant to Brookfield because the project that they had proposed is 3.7 acres in area, so they would not be able to develop under this alternative as the Planning Commission changed it. Brookfield's first point was that instead of a minimum acreage or a minimum density, that you should merely require an initial project in an area to be at least 50 units. And we take issue with that for the reasons that it doesn't generate a sufficient amount of development I should rephrase that. It does not necessarily generate a sufficient amount of development to create this critical mass for the establishment of a neighborhood, and it risks creating a series of relatively low-density, dispersed residential developments that don't create the kind of cohesive neighborhoods that we're looking at. I think one can argue about whether 10 acres is the right number and whether 50 units is the right minimum density, but I think by just putting a number of units in as a threshold, it does create these risks that I just described. The second item, create incentives for lot consolidation. We discussed at length with Brookfield in a telephone conference last week, and frankly, none of us could identify any form of incentive that would address this concern here. So we were kind of at a loss at how to respond to this. If, for example, we had, let's say, a very low maximum density, you might have a bonus for additional density. But given the underlying policy here, where we're trying to encourage a lot of residential development, it didn't really make sense to structure the regulations in that way. The third point, create a variety of residential products, buildings, and densities, is what we are attempting to do, although, again, one could argue about the actual numbers that we have put in. When we call for an average of 50 units per acre in the initial phase, we do contemplate that being a combination of low density and high density averaging to that number. And in fact, we have language in the policies that calls for a mix of building types. Moreover, in subsequent phases within each number, we drop the minimum down so to allow a greater range of building types, so that in a second phase you might have a higher density townhouse or garden apartment type configuration that presumably would also be balanced by other developments that would have higher densities as well. And then the third, or the fourth point rather, says overlay, create an overlay zone rather than identifying specific residential villages. Again, we want to emphasize that this is an illustrative drawing. This is not dictating where they are, although our analysis would indicate that these are the most likely places that they would occur. But I think what this is actually arguing for is something beyond that doesn't even talk about creating villages or aggregating them in any sense. Instead, just allowing the market to respond and determine where it's appropriate to build and at what density and at what scale. And again, the risk. It's true the market, there's a lot of wisdom in the market, of course, but there is a risk that you might not realize either the intensity of development that the environmental impact report is assuming, residential development, or you would not realize these more cohesive neighborhoods that we're seeking to develop.
Mr. Mayor, may
Yes.
I point out that late, while you were already in session, you received another piece of correspondence from Lucy Dunn, who is the president and CEO of the Orange County Business Council and was formerly the director of the state's Housing and Community Development Department. And she cites the shortage of housing in California, compliments Newport Beach for considering residential development in the airport planning area, and suggests that the general plan be as general as possible in this area to allow the market to create the opportunities.
So what do you recommend at the present time to accommodate the Brookfield proposal within the changes that we're making?
Well, the Brookfield project is already in public hearings at the Planning Commission, and this updated general plan will not be approved by the voters until November 2006, if they approve it. So I am assuming that the Brookfield project will have its decision prior to this general plan taking effect. And so the Planning Commission and Council can make a decision taking into consideration what we're trying to achieve here.
But doesn't this whole framework of having a minimum size of why we hired this consulting firm dictate that it's exactly what we should not be approving, the Brookfield project? I mean, it's because it's too small? Isn't that what it's all pointing to? Or why did we have this done?
Well, that is staff's and the consultant's opinion for the policy for the general plan. Whether the Planning Commission and the City Council want to agree with that, and if so, enforce it prior to adoption of the general plan as a policy decision.
The Planning Commission has looked at this and talks about a 5-acre site, right? So they had a bite of the apple. They looked, 10 was too big, 5 was fine. Yet they passed on this Lennar project, which is this the one we're doing tonight? Or Brookfield, rather, which is smaller than this?
Lennar, which is on your agenda tonight, is in Newport Center.
Right. So the Brookfield project is in direct conflict with what the Planning Commission wants to put in the general plan, and especially critical because there's not any of those services there now to begin with. This is one of the first projects out of the gate, right?
It's the first.
Well, then that's even more unique then. Salich, you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I guess I've got a question on the, I don't know if we're talking about it now or not, but if I understood it correctly, that there was a reference made that the Planning Commission is recommending reducing the number of units from 44,000 to 33, or whatever it is.
That's
that
correct.
Doesn't show in any of these policies, but I guess that refers back to our land use categories?
Yes, it's in the table up front.
So,
But is that more
so are we talking about that tonight, or?
We
or
should,
not?
we should, yes.
Okay, well, I guess I'd like to hear Council Member
That's on-
Davis' comments on that.
You're referring to page 11, towards the bottom of the page on the right column.
And also, I'd like to hear, Nancy Gardner, from GPAC, their comments on that also.
I think it was less a reduction and more of an affirmation of the 3,300 number, and I'm comfortable with that. I don't know how you feel about that, Nancy? Okay.
Okay.
But again, the EIR is being done on 4,300.
No, I understand that. I'm just looking to see if where we're headed in terms of GPAC and the council on this stuff. On policy 615.5, you referred, there's a statement added by the Planning Commission is presented in the economic development strategy. I guess I'm wondering what economic development strategy that is, because it seems to me that earlier in here they took out something that referred to economic development strategy, so it seems in conflict.
Yeah, I think it was the GPAC who took it out earlier, and it was the end of the evening when the Planning Commission added it here, and we didn't catch that.
And I think the intent was at least that there be some placeholder, I think that's why the Commission put it in, to identify specific incentives rather than just leaving it vague. And I think the comment from staff is, yes, there will be incentives defined, and that will be the ultimate tool to define it, but they're not defined yet.
We took it out because we hadn't read it, and we felt we couldn't pass on something we hadn't read.
Okay, well, there's a conflict there. It's got to, if we're going to be consistent, we should be doing it the same in both areas.
I'd delete it from both.
I delete it right now.
Okay. That's it, my comments.
Where do we go from here?
Is
Excuse me, Ms. Nichols.
There's no park that's going to be associated with the Brookfield, though, right? Is that, or am I wrong?
The Brookfield project is proposing private open space within the residential project. They are not proposing any land dedication within the airport area, although they will be subject to our usual in lieu fees for park dedication.
So basically, they are not an anchor property. They would be just in this without being the anchor property, so they wouldn't do the whole concept that we're proposing.
That's a good way of describing it, I think.
Okay, I just thought I'd try and make sure that you were on the same basis as I was. Do you agree, Mr. Selleck?
Sure.
Okay,
And I had a question for the city attorney. Are we required to apply yet to be adopted policies to Brookfield, or we're not required to apply?
No, you won't have to apply them. You may want to, because the Brookfield application is a zone change and it's a legislative act, you don't have an obligation to approve it. And so in looking at that legislative act, you can look into the future and see if you make that zone change, will it fit in, or will this project maybe fit into the future that you think might come about in that area, and making your considerations for your decision. But you don't have to require them to comply with it.
And with the legislative act, we have very broad discretion.
Yes.
Thank you.
But it would violate everything we're setting up.
Mr. Mayor, I've just got a general question from the staff. Doesn't really have to deal with anything in here, but on the RENA projections, how far out have they gone, and what is the projected number of units we're supposed to take?
I saw the planning director, I thought, turning the microphone on and was hoping she remembered the number because I don't. They're 5-year projections in the RENA, and they are almost 5 years old now, I think. You know, every time when the state has budgetary difficulties, they delay redoing the regional housing numbers, and so it'll probably be 7 years again. I think that our number for all income groups, including market rate, was somewhere in the neighborhood of 900.
I thought it was 400, but
I'm including
check.
Newport Coast.
Oh, I'm not including Newport Coast.
Well, I would just be curious as to, you know, I know that they don't project out the life of our land use plan, but you could probably extrapolate a projection out as to what you would anticipate they would say our share would be, and how these 3,000 units or so would fit into what, you know, we're ultimately going to be required to provide during the life of our land use plan.
We will be in, I think it's a good comment, we will, even though we're not, as a part of this effort, revising in total the housing element, we are going to be looking at the numbers there in January and be looking at some of those issues.
Yeah, well, the reason I make the comment, it just seems to me that there's a shortage of places to provide the housing that they're talking about, and it seems like that this area is going to meet a great deal of that requirement that's being placed on the city.
okay, what's our action item? Councilman Daigle, this is your district primarily. Why don't you
I don't know if there's public comment. I mean, I don't know if we have that after each one anyway. I know
We haven't had
remember-
public comment yet. Do you want public comment on this specific item?
Because of the timing for the evening, you may want to go ahead and open up public, you could open up public comment for everything that you're going to be discussing tonight. You don't have to do it.
Well, do you want
Section
public
by
comment on this
section.
specific item?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be helpful.
Good.
And
All right.
the airport area was the only one of the districts that the Planning Commission went through, so you won't have their thinking on anything beyond this.
Yeah.
So timing
All
has
right.
worked well. We planned it that way.
Well, you want to make a recommendation before we get, okay?
Thank you. My name is Dave Bartlett. I'm Vice President with Brookfield Homes. Appreciate the opportunity to address the council tonight on this issue. We have been probably the most active in the area because we do have a very alive, active project that's currently before the Planning Commission. And inevitably, this project will be looked through the eyes of this proposed general plan. And that's why we specifically are requesting recommendations that don't necessarily, that have an impact on our project, but also, we believe, improve the market viability of providing residential land use in the airport as a whole. Our recommendations are a combination of our consultation with EDA, who put together the plan for the Platinum Triangle, and actually quite a bit of the general plan language mimics the language that's in the Platinum Triangle zoning code. So there is a lot of specificity in this general plan, and I think, as Commissioner Hawkins said at the last Planning Commission meeting, a general plan should be general, and it should provide some guidance. There's a lot of details in this general plan that we respectfully would submit that maybe the zoning code should cover rather than this general plan, because if in fact, for instance, in this general plan, it says a minimum of 4 villages, well, you might not get 4 villages. And the reason you might not get 4 villages is that you don't have one parcel outside of the 1985 noise contour line that meets the requirements of 5 acres. And so, from the get-go, you're building in a variance or a waiver procedure for residential development and mixed-use development on these sites. So it's putting a pretty heavy burden on the development community in order to achieve that. So we want to make that very clear, and that's why we suggest the same language that's in the Platinum Triangle, which is you have to have a 50-unit minimum, period. And what have we seen that has been going on in the Platinum Triangle? We've seen 50 to the acre, we've seen 100 to the acre, we've seen projects that meet the more modest thresholds as well. So it's not that you're going to get sprinkled with all these, low-density projects. By the way, ours is about 24 units to the acre. I wouldn't really characterize it as low density, but one of the things that it does is it provides affordable housing opportunities. 17 of our units will be affordable units, and if you are in a high-rise situation, some of the units in Irvine, you can have homeowner association dues of $1,000 to upwards of $2,000 a unit, which would preclude affordable housing. So here we have a real live opportunity for affordable housing on site within the project that will meet the city's overall general regional housing needs. So that's the reason we're suggesting the 50-acre or 50-unit minimum. Regarding the lot consolidation, we tried to make this simple. And again, it's the genesis is partially the Platinum Triangle, but because you don't have any size parcel that meets the minimum out here, that's not affected by the 1985 settlement line or 1985 noise contour line, then you're forcing this lot consolidation program. And so it will require a lot of effort and a lot of time on behalf of property owners to cooperate with one another. So in order to facilitate that if a property owner can bring a parcel that's, say, 8 to 10 acres in size forward, then that property owner would be allowed a master land use plan process to be processed. And that master land use plan could be a lot more general and not as specific, and the developer then could get that approved, get his financing, then come back with final site plans, floor plans, elevations, sign plans, et cetera, with financing in place. That's a real strong incentive, and we support that incentive. I think the overlay zone was adequately characterized by Walter. We're just suggesting that instead of identifying specific villages, that you simply allow the market to determine where those villages should go based upon actual CNEL noise measurements. Our site measures at 64 CNEL from the airport. So those are the types of individual site studies that you're going to want to take into consideration before making a determination of where these villages should go. I think we can see the villages and the development of the site of the airport area do very well with being guided with some general principles in the general plan, as well as private investment that would actually work through the details and bring those details back before you on an individual case-by-case basis. Maybe one final note. On the Quail Street node, we would urge the council to remove the 5-acre minimum. That is a huge detriment to any parcel being developed out here. There's only one parcel out of 69 that meets the 10-acre minimum. And there's not any parcels except for the one that's on the corner of Corinthian and Dove that meets the 5-acre minimum. So I would urge you and Brookfield would urge you to eliminate the 5-acre minimum. And we would just ask for clarification on one item. Walter Rask indicated that the policies suggest that the acreage is waived in the Quail Street node and the density is waived in the Quail Street node, and And we're supportive of those policies, but I can't find them anywhere in here, and so I would seek some clarity on that.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Councilman Daigle?
No, go ahead. He has a question.
Okay.
If we were to ask a question, how would you propose, or you're on your side right now, but how would you propose to get this park and actually physically get the park to combine to help your community when it's developed and other communities that would be located in some group around yours to have? How would you propose to do that? I mean, I'm just, you do the dreaming for a moment rather than say, if in lieu fees tended not to get that accomplished. So how do we, so the concept was that we use the anchor property to do it. Okay, you're saying, well, gee, the anchor property won't allow normal development to take place or reasonable development to take place. Well, how do we get to the park? That's what we're trying to understand.
Well, if you get a parcel that's 8 to 10 acres in size, you will be able to get the park that you're looking for, and the smaller parcels would contribute their in lieu fees to help contribute to the improvements in those parcels. We have no issue at all whatsoever with the park requirements or standards, and as well as the concept plan that would have to be provided to show how we fit into the larger scope. We're very much in support of that, and we think that the vision for public and private open space can be met with the assemblage of the parcels. And again, the assembling the parcels is going to be a lot more difficult than I think people might imagine, and that's why we're suggesting that you allow the flexibility for processing and provide some incentive and only require a 50-unit minimum, and you will see the market take over and come forward and provide the types of critical mass that you're looking for.
The question is, though, what kind of language would you accept that would get us to that park? In other words, that would, we need to get the park associated with your project and others, how would you?
Well, I think the language in here gets you the parks you're looking for, but if I might suggest that you're going to be considering a general plan amendment here later this evening, and there were no public parks associated with that. It's been a case-by-case basis as projects have gone forward. I think what you've got here is you've got some guidance on how you might achieve these parks through public and private participation, and I think you can get there with the guidance that's in here. My opinion.
All right. Councilman Daigle? Rob, you have any questions for him? Anybody have any questions for him? Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any other public comment on this item? Nope, we're going to close public hearing. Okay. Councilman Daigle?
Well, my thoughts are that the policies are not required to apply to the Brookfield project. It's a legislative act, so we have broad discretion as far as that project. That project's clearly been designed to fly under the radar of green light, and I don't want to design our general plan around that project. We have dozens of property owners up there. We have only one applicant who has concerns with this policy, and I think that an enormous amount of effort has been put into this by our professional staff and consultants. We've gone to the GPAC and our Planning Commission, and I think what we have developed, I think will best serve our community.
So, you're in favor of the 5-acre change? Projects would be a minimum of 5 acres?
What is the requirement of the Planning Commission?
Is that what they had? That's what
That's
they said.
fine.
They knocked out, okay.
That's fine.
All right, good.
And then no further additions or reductions beyond that 4,300 to 3,300 unit count?
Okay, Selich?
I support that.
I'll support that, too.
Well, I guess my concern has been voiced by our speaker here. That's tough assemblage in certain areas to get a minimum 5-acre site with a lot of little parcels out there, and that might be a long time coming, or it puts it at a premium if you're the fifth acre. And there's And that's just, that's the marketplace. How did they come upon that 5-acre size, Sharon? How the Planning Commission come upon that?
First, let me just say, I don't think that any of these policies require consolidation. I think they require cooperation. I don't think that it has to be one project, one developer of the 5 acres or the 10 acres. Various property owners could cooperate.
Well, here's a perfect example. Brookfield doesn't have 5 acres. And they try and they try and they try, and that building on the corner, that guy doesn't budge. This project's dead. Is that right?
No, because what the policy, well, I'm sorry, yes.
It is dead.
The way
I mean, in other words, they
Planning
come in a year
Commission
later
changed it
after
to
this
the
time,
5
then we
acres.
don't get
Yeah.
any residential units out there unless it's a 5-acre size. And so we don't, and how many units are they proposing?
30,
Brookfield.
86.
So we don't get 86 units at all, because some landowners holding off from making that assemblage occur.
Yeah,
Mr.
but
Teller?
you can make that argument, if we go to a 3.5 acre minimum to accommodate them, you can make that argument for the guy that's got 3 acres.
No,
He
but
can't
my-
do it.
no,
You
but
gotta
my-
draw the line somewhere.
Well, but my point is, what's the point of the 5-acre? I mean, in other words, what does that get you versus 3.5 versus 3 versus letting the market dictate a minimum assemblage that, in other words, the only reason they would build it, somebody experiences Brookfield, because there's a market for it, and we're trying to superimpose a master plan for the area with then retail and everything else that they need to support it. So that's my point. You start doing minimum sizes, it might be a long time coming.
And I didn't answer your question as to how the Planning Commission got to the 5 acres, and this is the 5 acres for the exception, if you don't have the 10. It actually started with one commissioner being uncomfortable with the exception from the 10 acres at all, because he was concerned that then we wouldn't accomplish any of the urban form objectives we had. And then a couple of other commissioners started to think that that might be a good approach. And so I think that the 5-acre minimum was kind of a compromise from...
And what was the Planning Commission vote on that? You remember?
I think that they were unanimous on the 5 acres.
Okay, fine. Okay, let's do a polling again. We have 1, 2, 3. Leslie, 4? Okay, I'll stand aside. That's what we'll go with.
We're done.
It is 6 o'clock. We're reading the clock right. Okay, and is our task done for tonight?
Yes, thank
Okay,
you.
and when's the next chapter of this?
Next Tuesday, the 29th, the remainder of the land use element, and the Planning Commission will be meeting that afternoon.
Okay.
Do we leave our reports in the book for next time, or what? Do we leave these here or take them?
Why don't you take them?
Okay.
Okay, City Clerk, why don't you,
Public comments on non-agenda items?
any non-agenda items? Okay, we'll close public comment. We are going to close session, and we'll reconvene 7 o'clock for regular session.